Hello and welcome. I'm Sarah Coates and you're watching W News, broadcasting live from the Al Arabiya News headquarters. These are our top stories. Trump names his border czar as Tom Homan, tasked with carrying out the president's pledge of mass deportation. Israeli strikes on northern Lebanon and Gaza have killed dozens of people, including children, as the new Foreign Minister, Gideon Saar, claims there's been progress on a ceasefire in Lebanon. And the British Prime Minister meets President Macron in France for Armistice Day as they discuss the Ukraine war and the re-election of President Trump. But first, let's start in Saudi Arabia, where the country's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has called for an end to military operations in Gaza and Lebanon. In an address before the Joint Arab League and Organisation of Islamic Cooperation Summit in Riyadh, the Crown Prince called for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, condemning the massacre committed against Palestinian and Lebanese people. He also demanded Israel refrain from any further act of aggression. Here's what he had to say.
This summit is being held as an extension of the previous joint summit in light of the continued brutal Israeli attacks on the brotherly Palestinian people and the expansion of the scope of these attacks on the sisterly Lebanese Republic. The kingdom renews its condemnation and categorical rejection of the genocide committed by Israel against the brotherly Palestinian people, which has claimed the lives of 150,000 martyrs, wounded and missing, most of whom are women and children.
Joining me now is Dr. Abdulaziz Saga, the chairman of the Gulf Research Centre. Thank you so very much for your time. Firstly, urgent calls we're hearing here for an immediate ceasefire from the Crown Prince. In your opinion, how significant is this intervention today?
Thank you for having me first, and good time for everybody. I think it's an extremely important, almost a year ago, on the 11th of October 2023, Saudi Arabia have called for a large Arab, Islamic and Arab and Muslim summits that have taken place last year. And now again, today, they did regather again, and almost 94 between a country and organization have joined this important summit. The emphasis that the Crown Prince have put is to end an immediate stopping of the war and the killing of the mass killing and the genocide for the innocent people there also in Gaza and in Lebanon. I think what is interesting to see on the final statement, the communique, that issue of making sure that the international community do take care of their responsibility and pay enough attention to what they are supposed to do under the international law. Some time ago, unfortunately, we have seen countries have not really responded the way how they should respond to what is happening in Gaza and in Lebanon lately. But at the same time, the emphasis from the Crown Prince also been on the two-state solution as one of the Saudi important initiative started in 2002, and how important it is to continue this effort to bring an end to this situation and to bring peace and stability to the region. At the same time, it did authorize the Arab and Muslim Committee of Ministerial Council to continue their effort also and to encourage other countries as during this year, countries like Spain, Ireland, Slovakia, and other countries have joined. Norway, of course, have joined, and also to emphasize on the global commitment or the global coalition that Saudi have led since 28 September, and also the other meeting that took place in Riyadh, with regard to the effort of bringing more countries to recognize Palestine as a member of the UN. It is an outstanding effort. It's highly appreciated by the Muslim community and the Arab community, and many of the Western world that believe in fair and justice and believe in ending wars and ending killing innocent people.
Dr. Saga, the Saudi press agency also said that the key priorities for the summit include halting the aggression, protecting civilians, providing support to the Palestinian and Lebanese people, unifying positions and exerting pressure on the international community to take decisive steps to end the ongoing attacks and establish lasting peace and stability in the region. Can we expect a resolution or a joint statement?
Well, there will be a joint statement by the members' country, and I'm sure, it did emphasize in what you have just explained in ending the war and looking at the humanitarian situation and making sure that the international community do take care of their responsibility and be responsive to what is happening there. I think there is no disagreement amongst the convener and the meeting that have taken place are in full support of this direction.
And how can we expect Israel to respond to all of this?
I think Israel normally they respond once they see there is a big international consensus, and also there is a pressure from countries that they do have an important relation with, such as the US. And I'm sure when the US will be able to exert enough pressure on the Israeli to stop the aggression, to stop the mass killing, and to stop the genocide, I'm sure Israel would have to listen, because without the US outstanding support militarily, financially, and politically, Israel would not have been able to continue doing what they have done since 7th of October 23.
Dr. Abdulaziz Saga, we really appreciate your time this evening. Thank you so very much for coming on.
Thank you.
To the United States now, and Donald Trump's White House staff selection as he continues to assemble his team after last week's win. Well, he's named Tom Homan in his so-called border czar. Homan is the former acting director of Immigration and Customs Enforcement and is expected to carry out Trump's promise of mass deportation. For more on this story, I'm joined from Washington, D.C. by our chief correspondent, Simon Marks. Simon, great to have you. Firstly, tell us more about Tom Homan. How closely have the two worked together in the past?
Well, they've been absolutely hand in glove during the first Trump administration. Tom Homan headed up the Immigration and Customs Enforcement division for the president's era. And absolutely, Tom Homan has been positioning himself for many months as the man who wanted Donald Trump to appoint him in order to lead this effort to deport potentially as many as 20 million people living illegally in the United States. Tom Homan spoke at the Republican convention in Milwaukee. I think it is fair to say that he shares the far-right views of many of former President, now President-elect Donald Trump's supporters, and he's a zealot in terms of his desire literally to scour the country, to detain illegal immigrants living in the United States and then throw them out of the country. Indeed, he's been giving interviews here today in which he has said to cities and states run by the Democrats, if you're not going to help us in this effort, get out of the way, because we are, if necessary, going to flood law enforcement resources into your cities, into your states, to round these people up and remove them from the United States. So in Tom Homan, Donald Trump has absolutely found the kind of Make America Again loyalist, the kind of person who absolutely embraces the populist right-wing infused agenda of Donald Trump, and who is both willing and determined to strip the country of millions of illegal immigrants who currently call it home.
And Simon, bring us up to speed with other White House appointments.
Well, we just got word within the last few minutes that President-elect Donald Trump is about to name Stephen Miller his deputy White House chief of staff. Stephen Miller, of course, one of the architects of Donald Trump's domestic policies, including the mass deportation. He will be far and away the most right-wing figure in the United States ever to hold a position as senior as deputy White House chief of staff. We've also learnt earlier in the day that President-elect Trump is nominating Congresswoman Elise Stefanik of New York as his next United States ambassador to the United Nations. Elise Stefanik, who was once considered a possible running mate for Donald Trump in the election, a congresswoman who, a little bit like Senator J.D. Vance, didn't embrace Trumpism when she first arrived in Washington, but then realized it was the movement of the future and absolutely attached herself like a barnacle to the president-elect. So her reward appears to be, if she can secure Senate confirmation, a posting to the United Nations. This is a woman who once threatened to pull America out of the United Nations if it continued with what she referred to as its anti-Semitic policies. So these appointments taken together, plus appointments that we had already learnt of late last week, absolutely add to the sense that Donald Trump is determined in 2025 not to make the mistakes that he thinks he made back in 2017. He's not going to find common cause with people who do not share his philosophical and ideological outlook. He is going to populate every single level of this government to the best of his ability with proven loyalists to his viewpoint so that he can begin the process of really moving forward with his agenda.
And Simon, let's now move to Trump's relationship with President Vladimir Putin. And there are conflicting reports over whether or not they did, in fact, have this phone conversation that's being widely reported. What can we make of this?
Well, it seems pretty clear from this side of the Atlantic that that phone conversation did take place. People close to President Trump, members of his inner circle, are telling multiple reporters that there was a telephone conversation late last week between the Russian leader and the president-elect, in which it is said that Donald Trump told Vladimir Putin not to engage in any escalation of the war against Ukraine. He also spoke last week, as you know, Donald Trump, to President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine, a call in which Elon Musk also participated. There's no suggestion that Mr. Musk was on the line when Vladimir Putin's conversation with Donald Trump occurred. The Kremlin so far is not confirming that this conversation took place, and that may be because they want to present a different version of what happened in any kind of conversation to the Russian people than the conversation that Trump aides are relating. But it all indicates that as far as Ukraine is concerned, as with the war in Gaza, Donald Trump wants to get these two major foreign policy crises off his agenda as quickly as possible. I mean, he has said that he can resolve both of these conflicts on day one of his presidency. I mean, I don't think anybody fully thinks that that is likely, but it certainly indicates the extent to which he thinks that both of those conflicts are getting in the way of his main foreign policy desire, which is to start focusing on China. So that message to Vladimir Putin wasn't a message of withdrawing troops from Ukraine, but it was a warning not to escalate before Donald Trump finds himself in office.
That's Simon Marks in Washington, D.C. Simon, thank you. Let's go live now to Ukraine's capital, Kyiv, where we're joined by our correspondent, Megumi Lim. Megumi, of course, Trump's win will have major repercussions for the war. Firstly, what is the latest on the ground at this hour?
Well, the latest on the ground in Ukraine is that things aren't looking very good for Ukraine, especially on the battlefield. According to Ukrainian and U.S. officials, the Russian military has massed as many as 50,000 soldiers in Russia's Kursk region, and this includes North Korean soldiers. Now, we do not know how many of the 50,000 are North Korean soldiers, but what we do know is that it is looking like Russia is planning a major counteroffensive to try to retake territory from Ukrainian forces in the Kursk region. Now, just to give you some background of this area, Ukrainian troops currently hold about 600 square kilometers of territory since it launched its surprise incursion to this region in August of this year. And this incursion was aimed to try to pull some Russian resources and manpower away from the main front lines in Ukraine's eastern region, where Russia has been and still is advancing. But according to a new U.S. assessment that just came out, Russia was able to amass this force of 50,000 without pulling any soldiers away, any of its troops away from the front lines in Ukraine's east. So this is, of course, bad news for Ukraine. Ukrainian forces are severely outnumbered by Russian forces on the battlefield. And we've seen, even without the help of North Korean troops, Russian forces have been able to claw back already some ground in the Kursk region. So now, with this major counteroffensive that we are expecting, the question is, will Ukrainian troops be able to hold the line and hold on to this chunk of territory that they hoped could also have worked as some kind of leverage in potential future talks with Russia?
And Megumi, I understand that Ukraine's energy officials shut down power in some 4 regions, fearing further damage from Russian missile attacks. With winter well and truly setting in now, tell me, how will people cope during these extremely cold months ahead?
That's right. Emergency power cuts began this morning, Monday morning, after the Ukrainian Air Force issued a nationwide aerial alert warning that a large number of Russian jets had taken off. And according to Ukrainian intelligence, Russia was planning to again attack the country's energy infrastructure. Now, this is hugely concerning because right now, Ukraine has already lost more than half of its power generating capacity due to attacks that took place in the summer of this year. And right now, Ukraine is mostly reliant on its nuclear energy infrastructure, which is also, of course, exposed to potential missile attacks from Russia. And experts are saying that if these attacks do continue against Ukraine's energy infrastructure, blackouts of up to 20 hours a day could take place in the winter months. Now, people here, for this reason, are expecting the worst winter of war. And how are they going to cope with this? Well, first of all, it's worth mentioning that this is not the first winter of blackouts that Ukrainians are having to endure. The first winter of war, Ukrainians endured long bouts of blackouts as well, just not as long as what we're anticipating this winter. Businesses have managed to adapt. They have bought diesel-powered generators to keep their businesses operating, restaurants, cafes, bars, shops, even though at a lower power capacity. But if these blackouts do last as long as 20 hours, these generators are not going to be enough. It's going to be devastating for the Ukrainian economy to see these businesses not be able to remain open during the winter months. But also just imagine for the people, you know, Ukraine is a country where temperatures can drop to as low as minus 20 degrees Celsius. It's going to be a very cold winter without electricity. And also just imagine people who are living in higher floors of high-rise apartments without a functioning elevator, having to walk up and down so many flights of stairs. And for many of these high-rise buildings, electricity supply being cut off also means water supply being cut off. So we are expecting a very, very difficult winter ahead, possibly not just with electricity cut off, but also water supply cut off for many people living here.
Yeah, certainly a very worrying situation. Megumi Lim there, live in Kiev. Thank you. Let's have a look at the rest of today's news. World leaders have begun arriving in Azerbaijan's capital, Baku, for the annual UN Climate Summit, COP29. This year's focus is on how countries are planning on limiting long-term temperature rises. It comes as the United Nations says this year will be the hottest on record. The Prime Minister of Haiti has been sacked less than 6 months into the job. The country brought Gary Connie in to handle the ongoing gang-led security crisis. Mr. Connie has described his dismissal as illegal, adding it raised serious concerns about Haiti's future. Japan's Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba has been elected to another term, winning a runoff vote in Parliament to retain his position. The 67-year-old suffered a setback last month after his coalition lost its majority in the lower house. One person has been killed and 16 others injured after a shooting at a US university. The incident at Tuskegee University in Alabama took place during homecoming week. A 25-year-old man has been arrested and charged. Israel's new Foreign Minister Gideon Sa'ar said just hours ago that there's been certain progress in efforts to end the fighting with Hezbollah in Lebanon. Sa'ar says they're working with the Americans and that any agreement would have to include enforcement mechanisms to prevent Hezbollah from reconstituting its military infrastructure near the border. However, a Hezbollah spokesman says the militant group has not received any official proposals and will continue to wage the war. For more, I'm joined by our correspondent Giles Gibson live in Tel Aviv. Giles, lovely to see you. Firstly, what can we make of these comments from Gideon Sa'ar? Is there any optimism here that Hezbollah says it hasn't received this official proposal? Any optimism of moving forward, really?
Yeah, Hezbollah saying that they've not received an official proposal, but if you look at some of the language that a Hezbollah official used in Beirut just a few hours ago, they talk about testing the waters, initial ideas, and also a great movement between Washington, Moscow and Tehran and a number of capitals. So I think that does add to this sense across the region that the Biden administration is really now starting to put pressure on the different players in this conflict to reach some sort of a ceasefire deal. I suppose the problem for the Biden administration as their time in office ticks down is that there are just so many different players involved in this conflict and in this region. You have, for example, the Israeli foreign minister also saying that he wants to see the Russians, who of course have a military presence inside Syria, guaranteeing that no weapons cross from Syria into Lebanon and then into the hands of Hezbollah. So I suppose that the problem for the Biden administration is that, you know, they can push harder, they can take more risks than they've done in recent months, but that doesn't necessarily guarantee that they'll get what they want.
Just yesterday, Giles, the incoming Defence Minister, Israel Katz, at the swearing-in ceremony for Gideon Sa'ar said that Israel had defeated Hezbollah on the battlefield. Is this related to the statement above in any way, or is this just confusing?
I think confusing is the right word, because it just gives you a sense that there are these very mixed messages coming from the top ministers in the Israeli government. Just looking closer at some of the comments that Israel Katz made, he talked about the crowning achievement of that victory being the killing of Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah. And if you look at the stated aims that Israel announced when it said that it was going into southern Lebanon with this ground offensive, they're very different to what Israel Katz is talking about. For example, they said that they want to return thousands of displaced citizens from northern parts of Israel who've been pushed out of their homes by repeated rocket attacks. And look, just in the last 12 hours or so, there have been a series of rocket attacks across that northern part of Israel, and also a little bit further south, the IDF saying that around about 90 rockets were launched towards the city of Haifa. So in that sense, the Israeli military, the Israeli government have not achieved the stated aims of this offensive.
And Giles, just with regards now to Gaza, that deadline that was set by the United States, November 13, to get more of this desperately needed aid into the Gaza Strip or risk a weapons cut-off. Is there any indication that more aid is getting in, or even that Israel is heeding these calls?
Yeah, Sarah, there are a few indications that more aid is starting to flow into Gaza. We've had the IDF telling us that they have expanded the humanitarian zone that's been set up in the south of Gaza, and observers who are at different checkpoints between Israel and the enclave of Gaza said that very early on Monday morning local time here in Israel, there were more aid trucks flowing into the area. The expectation is, or the estimate is, that around about 150 aid trucks are moving into Gaza every single day. That compares to about 30 or so back in October, when the Biden administration really made this sort of veiled threat to the Israeli government. But I think you still have to look at that in the wider context of the fact that the UN say that before the war started, there were about 500 aid trucks going into Gaza on a daily basis. So at the moment, the numbers are, yes, they're going up, but they just do not compare to the amounts that aid officials are saying that they need to see every single day.
Certainly right. Giles Gibson live in Tel Aviv. Giles, thank you. Let's have another look at the rest of today's news. One woman has been injured and flights from major airports have been disrupted after Moscow was targeted with the biggest drone strike since the war with Ukraine began. Russia's defense ministry says 70 drones were shot down overnight in its territory, including 34 over the outskirts of the capital. Britain's Defence Secretary says Donald Trump is committed to NATO and is right to push other European nations to shoulder the security and economic burden. John Healey denied reports the incoming US president-elect will end his country's relationship with the military alliance. The Prime Minister of Spain has announced a new economic relief package worth over $4 billion in the aftermath of the country's worst natural disaster in 60 years. 220 people were killed around the area of Valencia last month, with many still reported as missing. Well, many are blaming Pedro Sanchez's government for being badly prepared and responding too slowly. Well, the British Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, has visited Paris today for the annual Armistice Day celebrations. Arriving at the Elysee Palace, he was met with a hug and handshake from Emmanuel Macron as the two leaders discussed the wars in Ukraine and Gaza, as well as Donald Trump's recent re-election win. And for more on this story, I'm joined by our correspondent, Ollie Barrett, standing by in London. Hello, Ollie. Firstly, is this being seen as a successful meeting between the two leaders? And do we know what was discussed inside?
Hi, Sarah. Well, London and Paris certainly feel that this was a successful meeting. Emmanuel Macron, the French president, really going out of his way to extend a personal invitation to Keir Starmer and really welcoming him with open arms, as you were saying, in Paris. We saw them inspecting military service personnel together. We saw them laying a wreath together for Armistice Day. But there were also discussions in a meeting before the Armistice Day commemorations were attended by both the leaders together. We are told by Downing Street that they discussed Ukraine, they discussed the Middle East as well, they discussed the issue of illegal migration as well. But as you were suggesting, clearly the backdrop to all of this is the re-election of Donald Trump in the United States of America and what that might mean for various spheres of cooperation between the UK and France with relation to Ukraine, the Middle East, climate, with Keir Starmer also leaving France and heading to Baku for the COP29 summit in Azerbaijan as well. So certainly London and Paris feel that this was a successful meeting with a lot to discuss, and as I say, all of it being seen through the prism of the re-election of Donald Trump in the United States.
And Ollie, Starmer's British government has been critical of Trump in the past. Is there hope that France could become more of a British ally?
Well, you also have to remember that this comes after an election of a government here in the UK insisting that it wants to reset its relations with key European Union allies. And since the re-election of Donald Trump, when it comes to trade policy, for example, the British and other European countries are really looking at contingencies if, for example, Donald Trump does go ahead and impose swathes of tariffs on goods being exported by European countries to the United States of America. So that absolutely will have been on the agenda for the discussions between the two. That said, London is convinced that it can have a positive relationship with the incoming Trump administration as well. It's put quite a lot of effort into that. With regards to Ukraine policy, what we understand was likely to be discussed between the two today was the issue of Storm Shadow missiles and whether the British and the French can persuade Joe Biden to authorise the use of Storm Shadow missiles by Ukraine deep inside Russian territory. That is something certainly that the Ukrainians would like, especially in the context where there is fears in Kiev of perhaps American support tapering off when Donald Trump returns to the White House. So Ukraine will have been front and centre in these discussions. Downing Street not giving us any detail today on whether there was any progress made when it comes to discussing Storm Shadow missiles and their use by the Ukrainians and the potential sign-off by the current President Joe Biden. But certainly that is what we expect that they were discussing in these meetings. There are lots of ways in which the UK feels it can be close to European capitals, partly as a result of the re-election of Donald Trump. But as I say, this is a government that came into power here in the UK saying anyway that it wanted to boost its ties with European countries post-Brexit.
Ollie Barrett live for us in London. Ollie, thank you. To business news now, and the price of Bitcoin has risen above $80,000 for the first time. The record surge coming after Donald Trump's election win last week, with Trump promising during his campaign to make the United States the crypto capital of the world. Meanwhile, the euro has taken a hit, 4.5-month low against the US dollar today. It's as investors express concern over potential US tariffs proposed by the incoming president-elect. To sport now, and world number one Yannick Sinner is on course to win the ATP finals for the first time after beating Australian Alex de Minaur. The Italian has already won the Australian and US Open titles. Meanwhile, Czech player Barbora Krejcikova has asked for respect and professionalism in sport after comments were made about her appearance by journalist John Wertheim. Wertheim has now been taken off air after making a jibe about Krejcikova's forehead during the WTA finals in Riyadh. The new manager of Manchester United says he's ready to take on the difficult task when he arrives from Portugal. Ruben Amorim leaves Sporting Lisbon and has signed with the Red Devils until June 2027. He takes over from Erik ten Hag and manager Ruud van Nistelrooy. Let's remind you of tonight's top stories. Trump names his border czar as Tom Homan, tasked with carrying out the president's pledge of mass deportation. Israeli strikes on northern Lebanon and Gaza have killed dozens of people, including children, as the new Foreign Minister Gideon Saar claims there's been progress on a ceasefire in Lebanon. And hugs and handshakes on the steps of the Elysee Palace. The British Prime Minister meets President Macron in Paris as they discuss the ongoing Ukraine war and the re-election of President Trump. And that's it for all of us at W News. Thanks for joining us. GNT with Tom Burges Watson is coming up next.
From the White House to Gaza, Kiev to Beijing, elections, economics and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deep fake and artificial intelligence,
they've got to have a vote and a say.
It's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
My campaign is going very well.
presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers.
As Arabs, as Middle Eastern, we're too emotional.
Join me on the Riz Khan Show for empowering conversation. Hello and welcome. I'm Riz Khan in Washington, D.C., the capital of a nation that is still coming to terms with the outcome of the U.S. elections. In this episode, we'll consider the implications for this divided country, for the Democratic Party, and for conflicts in the Middle East and beyond. First up, Al Arabiya's chief correspondent, Simon Marks, has seen it all during decades of covering the political beat in Washington. But he's never seen anything quite like this. So, Simon, 8 elections you've now covered. How did this one compare with the previous one?
Well, you know, Riz, I think that it is always said every 4 years that the United States is about to engage in the most important election of everybody's lifetime. And Americans are always told, you know, the future of the country depends on the outcome of this election. This time round, it had the added benefit of being true. Right? There is no question that this was the most important election any of us is ever going to cover. Because of the stakes, and the stakes are absolutely clear. We know that the Trump 2.0 administration is going to be much more radical. I mean, this is what they describe their plans to be, than its predecessor, that he's learnt from what he thinks were the mistakes of the past, which was the coming to terms with people that didn't necessarily agree with him but brought expertise to the administration. So I think that it was always apparent that this was going to be an absolutely vital campaign, and a campaign that was elemental in terms of discussing the future of American democracy. And then the twists and turns, the departure of Joe Biden from the race, the drama of that, the injection of Kamala Harris being given 107 days to try and persuade Americans to get behind her. First of all, she had to introduce herself to them. Then she had to explain her policies to them. She was better at the first part than the second part. And it all culminated with the repudiation of Democrats, both in the battle for that building, but also in the battle for Congress, for the United States Senate.
So that's what I was wondering, with those twists and turns you just described, how difficult did it make your job? Because, of course, you're always expected to be on top of things, but, you know, you wake up and things have changed that morning.
Yeah, I mean, there's no campaign where everything goes according to plan for the two candidates, and indeed the whole concept of the October surprise, which is never that much of a surprise in recent years, exists to underscore the fact that this is always going to be a deeply, deeply unpredictable campaign. But a campaign in which you see the President of the United States succumb to a cabal by members of his own political party, orchestrated by one of his best friends, Nancy Pelosi, with whom Joe Biden has not spoken since he was defenestrated. The notion that we were going to watch his rival, Donald Trump, first of all defeat him in a television debate, then survive an attempted assassination that produced some of the most iconic images any American election has ever generated. You know, him getting back on his feet, the hand in the air, fight, fight, fight. The two conventions, always great images, you know, iconic images that come out of that. The Republicans leaving their convention in Milwaukee, absolutely convinced that they had this election in the bag because they were still at the time taking on Biden, then getting knocked on the back foot by Biden being replaced by Kamala Harris, then the attempted assassination, the attempted assassination, of course, happened before the Republican convention. All of these things brought together and underscored, I think, a really brittle sense in this country that the tension, the anxiety, just the sheer length of the campaign, the amount of money that was spent on it, the fundraising itself. I mean, all of us, journalists, my wife, who's not a journalist any longer, receiving endless fundraising messages on email, on telephones. Every 10 minutes her phone was buzzing with another request for funds. It's all added to this notion of tension and unease here.
And it's all about the aftermath. One of the big worries was the country was so divided that whatever the outcome, there would be potentially violence on the streets, there would be a lot of division. What sense do you have, it's only been a few days, but what sense do you have of the aftermath?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, there's a building down there that is a commercial building that just a couple of days ago was ringed with fencing because the owners of the building were worried that, like the White House and the Vice President's residence, it could get ransacked and looted in the event of violence. That has all suddenly dissipated because really of the size of the victory. I mean, I think that this town particularly is despondent. It's a Democratic Party stronghold. There are thousands, probably tens of thousands of people here who realize they're not going to be able to stay here, partly because Donald Trump wants to replace them with ideologues, and partly because, you know, in every time there's a transition, the Republicans are coming to town, the Democrats in large measure are leaving. But I think the shock to the system of the size of the victory, the one outcome of this election that no one thought was likely was a Trump landslide. Democrats said they thought a Kamala Harris landslide might happen. Most people thought narrow win for Kamala Harris, narrow win for Donald Trump, days, weeks of tension, possible unrest, possible protest. Nobody thought it's going to be a Donald Trump landslide and it will be resolved within hours of polls closing. And that's where we are, and the Democrats have said they're going to engage in a peaceful transition. And I think that mostly in this town there will be despondency, especially when we get to January, and we're going to see some very uncomfortable imagery relating to Democrats leaving the White House, the Republicans arriving. I mean, it'll be not entirely dissimilar, I suspect, to when Donald Trump came visiting the White House after his first election win, and there's this iconic picture of Obama staffers gathered on the lawn watching Trump arrive, and they all look like absolute death warmed up. And I think we're going to see similar imagery this time around.
Have you had a chance to talk to any of Donald Trump's detractors? People
Yes.
like John Bolton, who, you know, was terrified of, to some degree, terrified of a Trump
Yes.
victory, because he said, you know, now this time, as you alluded to in the first part of this, that he really has a better idea of what he can do. And what have those detractors? I mean, some of them have to run for the hills according to the threats.
Well, some of them have already left town. I mean, I know of two detractors, both of whom are not in Washington, D.C. One had already decided to leave the city some years ago and just get out of Dodge altogether, and the other one of whom deliberately positioned themselves overseas during election week because they were worried about what might happen. And in the aftermath of election week is suggesting that they are going to decouple themselves from the United States and establish themselves overseas instead. I think there is going to be an awful lot of that. And I think it will be because some people physically fear their own safety. And I think it is also because lots of other people will realize that their ability to build their careers here and, you know, pay their bills and look after their families is going to be heavily constrained as a result of the outcome of this election. So they're, in many cases, looking overseas. I was talking to a friend in London earlier today who was telling me that he works for a firm that has a department that deals with expats that is apparently overrun in the last 48 hours with requests from Americans for more information about how they can move and rebase themselves in the UK. So I think you're going to see a lot of movement.
What about those who suddenly seem to side with Donald Trump, RFK Jr.,
Absolutely.
Elon Musk? I mean, those were kind of surprise twists.
Opportunity knocks, doesn't it? I mean, Jeff Bezos, you know, who stopped the Washington Post here from publishing an endorsement of Kamala Harris and sent Donald Trump congratulations messages over Elon Musk's social media platform yesterday. I mean, opportunity knocks, absolutely. Elon Musk definitely going to play some role in government. I think not in a cabinet position, because to do that he'd have to divest himself from his business interests, which seems extremely unlikely. But he's clearly going to be a Trump whisperer. RFK Jr., I mean, There is talk about becoming the Secretary of Health and Human Services. I mean, some in Trump world have denied that's the plan, but RFK Jr. keeps fueling the notion. You're going to see ideologues and some of these external figures, these characters that have attached themselves to Donald Trump like a barnacle, playing a role in the administration. I think it's absolutely vital to underscore that Trump 2.0 is not going to look anything like Trump 1.0. First Trump Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, lovely man, foisted on him by Condoleezza Rice because she said, you need a man who understands the world. Rex Tillerson, this guy from Exxon, he'll sort you out. There's going to be none of that. General Jim Mattis, James Comey at the FBI, they're not going to work with any of these people. And that's going to change the character of this city.
Having seen how tight the polls were literally up to the end, the landslide victory was, of course, that much more of a surprise. To what degree do you think it might say something about America not being ready for a woman president, as they keep saying, possibly even not one of colour?
There's no question that that was a factor. I think there are multiple factors in the Democrats' demise in this election, but misogyny and racism was clearly a substantial issue. Barack Obama himself identified particularly the racist aspect of it when he went on the campaign trail and said that black men particularly he was hearing and believing were saying that they were not ready for a black woman in power. I think the misogyny issue is strong. I'm not sure it's as strong as it was in 2016 when Hillary Clinton lost her race, but it's definitely still a factor. But the Democrats' drubbing was so comprehensive that it's about more than that. In 2020, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris won 81 million votes. 4 years later, Kamala Harris and Tim Walz won 66 million votes. That's 15 million people who have decided they don't want to vote Democratic this time round. Some of them may have racist reasons for doing that. Some of them may have misogynistic reasons for doing that. Bernie Sanders says a lot of them are members of the working class who feel that the Democratic Party has abandoned them, so they're going to abandon the Democratic Party. We know that many of them are Latino voters who are American citizens from Latino families who are hostile to the new wave of illegal immigrants coming into the country because they argue they pulled themselves up by their own bootstraps, did everything the way you were supposed to do it legally, and they support the deportation of some of these illegal immigrants. So I think that the question for the Democratic Party now is elemental. I mean, clearly so many things went so wrong, even including how long it took to put the arm on Biden to get him to abandon his re-election quest, that there's no one thing you can fix or blame. You can't say it's just misogyny or it's just racism. It is a whole packet of problems that the Democratic Party didn't see coming.
You know, Simon, there was a lot of talk about uniting the country after the election. I certainly know, I come here frequently and I sense the tensions and the divisions. Do you see any, as someone who's covered so much of this going on, do you see any signs there might be a move towards unity?
I mean, they always talk of a move towards unity after every election. And by the time the cadences of the sentence have finished echoing around the room that you're in, those calls have gone nowhere and are going to go nowhere. This is a tribal, 50-50 polarized nation. And there is nothing that the outcome of this election or Donald Trump's arrival in the White House said yesterday is going to heal the nation, said that before, then he came and made the inaugural speech about carnage in America. There's no fixing it. These are two tribal groups of followers of the Democratic Party and the new Trump-dominated Republican Party, with disaffected Republicans in the middle, not quite sure where they're going to end up. And finding common cause between any of these people is going to be difficult, and it's going to be increasingly difficult because it's geographical, right? I mean, there are places where Republicans feel comfortable and at home, and there are places where Liberal Democrats feel comfortable and at home, and the twain don't often mingle and meet. And I think there's a fundamental problem to the concept of a homogeneous society in one nation here, because it increasingly doesn't exist.
Well, of course, all the factions came out during the campaign, and you saw the Arab Americans, black Americans and so on. The Arab American story was an interesting one. How many people actually decided to support Trump?
Yes.
From the Arab American community? Some people believe it's because of the backlash due to the lack of action taken by the Biden administration with the Israel-Gaza conflict. And some just, I guess, feel that Donald Trump is going to be someone who represents them better. He's promised to stop all wars in a day, basically. But they're going to have to face the consequences of what he does or doesn't do now.
Yes, and remember that he's talked about possibly reimposing his Muslim travel ban, which is going to have an enormous community impact on the Arab American community. But, I mean, the Arab American community in this election played a fascinating role because they essentially said to the Democratic Party, enough. For 3 election cycles now, Barack Obama has gone to all Democrats and said, you may be disappointed in what we've done. Perhaps we haven't delivered on the things that you wanted, but you've got to vote for us because we're better than this guy, right? The Arab American community and other Democrats furious over Gaza in this election said, no, we're not going there. We're not doing it again. Bill Clinton traveled to Michigan days before the election and said to the Arab American community, Kamala Harris has said she's going to do what she can do to end the war, and she's going to try and advance the prospects of peace through diplomacy. That ought to be enough. That was the phrase he used to Arab American voters. Get over it. It ought to be enough. And it wasn't enough. And they had Jill Stein in Michigan, third-party candidate, appealing for their support. You can deny Kamala Harris the White House by voting for me if you don't want to vote for Donald Trump. And it proved to be effective. And I think that message to Democrats is a broader message than one that's just coming from the Arab American community. You can't keep saying, vote for us, because you may not like us very much, and we may have disappointed you, but we're still better than the alternative. They have to go back into the kitchen and cook up a better proposition than that for 2028.
Having followed all the promises, and of course they are just campaign promises, what are you expecting to occur in this coming year, for example, or say post-January in 2025, when it comes to Russia-Ukraine and to Israel-Gaza?
Well, let's do Russia-Ukraine first. He's going to force Volodymyr Zelensky to make peace with Vladimir Putin and to give up parts of eastern Ukraine and Crimea. I mean, I think everybody understands that. The Europeans understand that. President Zelensky understands that. Vladimir Putin certainly understands that. He wants it done and dusted. And this is not just Trump, but the key figures that surround him in the foreign policy field say, we need to get this sorted out because we don't want to be obsessively involved in European security. We want to focus our attention on China. Europe's got to look after its own affairs. And the first plank of that is we sort out Ukraine, and the only way you sort out Ukraine is by pulling American military support and forcing Zelensky to make peace. So I think that's relatively clear. On Gaza, Trump and Netanyahu have been talking all the time. They've been speaking in recent days. Before the election, they were talking, with reports that Donald Trump said to Benjamin Netanyahu, get the military action in Gaza wrapped up by the time I take over in the Oval Office, because then it's got to be all about the day after resolving Gaza in whatever way you can, getting the hostages out to become a big problem for any occupant of that White House if there are still American citizens being held hostage by Hamas in Gaza. But for the Trump administration, it's all about the Abraham Accords. It's all about expanding them, trying to bring about the normalization in ties between Israel and Saudi that many here in Washington believe that Hamas attacks of October the 7th was designed to derail. And so they want to get that Saudi track moving. And the way they think they do that is by ending the violence in Gaza, moving to the day after, which is obviously the really complicated bit, while simultaneously using the communication channels that they opened up through the Abraham Accords to try and get back to a place where you can think about the normalization of ties between Tel Aviv and Riyadh. That's what he's going to go for. It will obviously be incredibly complicated and difficult to get there.
Simon, to wrap up, with 8 elections now under your belts, do you ever see a third party emerging in the US? It seems like the idea of a third voice just completely disappeared this time.
I thought you were going to ask me if I've got a 9th one in me.
Yeah, well, there is that as well.
To which the answer is I'm not sure. A third party is so difficult here because the Republicans and the Democrats, we talk about them being the two big political parties. They're not just political parties. They are money machines. And one of the most amazing things about this election has been the fundraising. This has been a $10.5 billion election. Kamala Harris raised a war chest of $1 billion and was still asking for money from Americans even as the election got underway. So for a third party truly to catch fire, it's got to have big money behind it and national organizational heft. And that's why the genius, in a way, of Donald Trump was not to launch a third party. It was to take over the Republican Party and completely retool it from the inside. And that ultimately may be what some Democrats out there want to do with the Democratic Party. But to do that, you've got to say goodbye to Nancy Pelosi. She's a major cash provider through her fundraising capacities to the Democratic National Committee. The Obamas, obviously amazing fundraisers. You're going to have to take the reins of the party and then retool it, much as Donald Trump has done with the Republican Party, because launching a third party here is just so incredibly difficult. The climb is too steep.
It's frightening, isn't it? It's all about the money now.
It's absolutely all about the money, 100%.
Simon Marks, let's hope you get a ninth election in you, because I'd love to come back and talk to you.
Thank you, Riz.
Cheers. Well, my next guest is the Palestinian-American political analyst Omar Badar. I wanted to get his perspective on the role of Arab-American voters during the elections, as well as the likely impact of a second Donald Trump presidency on the wars in Gaza and Lebanon. Omar, it's been a few months since we last had a chance to chat, and a lot has changed. What are your expectations in terms of U.S. foreign policy under a second Trump presidency?
You know, it's extremely unpredictable. If it's going to be anything like the first Trump presidency, we are looking at a situation of complete and total chaos in the region. Trump, the first time he came along, promised that American policy is going to be even more pro-Israel than it already was. And that meant recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital, endorsing Israeli settlement expansion in the Palestinian territories, endorsing Israel's takeover of the Golan Heights in Syria, moving the embassy, and the list goes on of just letting Israel do whatever it wants and basically giving diplomatic cover to whatever Israel wanted to do. And at this point, we're right now witnessing a scale of Israeli atrocities in Gaza, in the West Bank, and in Lebanon that is really unprecedented. And Trump's promise that he's going to be even more pro-Israel right now is frankly terrifying, because it's difficult to imagine how much more pro-Israel it can get compared to the Biden administration that has given Israel a carte blanche to do whatever it wants to as well.
And yet, one of his campaign promises, I will end all wars. He says he can end it in a day. That contradicts that.
Yeah, it is a complete and obvious contradiction. And it's obvious that Trump does not really care much. All of it is campaign rhetoric. And he's, frankly, himself unpredictable as well. So it's not really clear in which direction he's going to move once he actually comes into office. But there is an obvious contradiction between this idea that he's going to let Israel, quote unquote, finish the job, and also being the anti-war candidate. Those things don't go together. Israel's project is one of endless war, trying to wipe out Gaza, trying to completely ethnically cleanse the northern part of it, and now stuck in Lebanon, also in a quagmire that does not have any positive horizon on the future where you can actually end that conflict, because we're entrenched in a situation in which Israel is demanding complete and total submission from Hezbollah in Lebanon, and that is simply not going to be in the cards in the coming months.
There is that grey area of a few weeks between the actual election result and the inauguration, and it's still the Biden presidency until then. What chance is there, considering these possible contradictions, these possible twists, that the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu could use this as an opportunity to scale things up until the Trump presidency is intact?
Yeah, I think we are already watching that actually unfold, where Netanyahu has escalated the violence in North Gaza in a very, very significant way, taking advantage of the fact that there's simply not going to be any major American policy interventions right now. Biden is towards the end of his presidency, and there is an anticipation of what Trump might do. And even with the uncertainty of what Trump brings with him, this is certainly the moment for Israel to try to do as much damage as possible, to try to capture as much land as possible, and to basically carry out in a fashion where the international community and the United States, particularly as the patron state that needs to sign off on whatever Israel does, is simply not going to be present in any meaningful way. So you can effectively say that Netanyahu is in charge of American foreign policy for this period, as far as the region is concerned, and is free to do whatever he wants.
Isn't there also, though, an argument that this is a window for Joe Biden to perhaps get a last-minute boost to his legacy by saying, well, you know, he's got nothing to lose by actually pushing very aggressively.
This assumes that Biden has the cognitive ability to actually do what's good for him. If he had that, he would have done policy very, very differently on Palestine and Israel for a very long time. Certainly, this would be an opportunity, but I have absolutely no confidence that Joe Biden is in any shape right now to try to think about what that legacy looks like and the desperate moral imperative of putting a stop to this onslaught in Gaza and being on record as the person who actually put an end to it. He doesn't seem to be interested in that. And frankly, I don't think he has the mental faculty to really intervene at this point in a way that would save his legacy, in addition to the endless lives of Palestinians.
Even if he did, I presume that it's really up to Benjamin Netanyahu to concur.
Yeah,
which doesn't seem to be the case.
It's you know, we've had all this talk constantly about Biden being upset with Netanyahu, being frustrated with Netanyahu, refusing to meet with him. But at the end of the day, as long as American military funding and diplomatic protection continues unabated, then Netanyahu has no reason to take any of these concerns seriously. They're simply just rhetoric. And right now, for Biden to actually step up to a level where he's willing to threaten U.S. military funding for Israel based on Israel's behavior just seems really implausible. But frankly, it might be the only thing that would change Israel's behavior in the meantime, apart from suffering a devastating defeat in a regional conflict that looks like it's about to spiral completely out of control as well.
I'll get onto that in a moment, but since we spoke in mid-March, things really have gotten even worse in Gaza. Could you have predicted it to reach this kind of level? And where does this leave the idea of any real ceasefire?
I don't think anybody could have seen how bad things were going to get into Gaza. I think the entire world operated on the idea that we would not witness a full-scale genocide with the world being silent and not intervening to stop it. And yet this is precisely what we have witnessed, is that we've had over a year of this, entire families being wiped out and children being starved to death. We are watching this on our TVs day in and day out. And yet the United States is ensuring that there is no intervention that would put an end to this. And yeah, it is insane that we have allowed things to reach this level. And at this point, I think there is simply no end in sight. We're finally at the point where I'm realizing, at least, that there is no red line for Israel, period, that they can actually go as far as they want to. And it's really going to be a matter of how things devolve in the region rather than the U.S. playing the role that they have always intended to play. They've always talked about playing. The U.S. as a leader of democracy and human rights and values and freedom and all of that, it's just has been utterly dismantled by U.S. embrace of the extremist and fanatical policies of the Israeli government at this point, that I don't see a prospect for a change.
And, you know, it's become even worse with Lebanon now being roped into it. And you couldn't have really predicted that at the time, or could you?
I mean, look, Lebanon, it felt inevitable. Frankly, I was one of the few people who was tweeting long before things escalated that this was inevitable. You have a setup where the only way out of that confrontation spiraling out of control would have been a ceasefire in Gaza. That is the only way that you would have put an end to it. And once it became clear that the U.S. has no interest in stepping in to achieve that ceasefire, to rein Israel in and put an end to this onslaught, then what was happening in Lebanon was absolutely inevitable. Because Hezbollah was determined that they were not going to stop what they were doing until the war on Gaza ends and until the onslaught and the genocide there comes to an end. And from Israel's perspective, they have a deterrence capacity that they're super invested in preserving. For them, the entire way that Israel can function in the region is through a relationship of regional dominance and dominance by force. So Hezbollah constantly engaging in these cross-border skirmishes it was inevitable that Israel was going to overreact at some point and go all in. And right now, of course, they are stuck in a situation where they can't win. They can cause immense damage to Lebanon from the air. But in order to defeat Hezbollah, you would need to send ground troops basically into Lebanon. And that fight is not going well for Israel at all. Hezbollah is able to inflict significant damage on Israel on the ground. And we are stuck in Israel is stuck in a quagmire where, sure, Lebanon is suffering the heavier end of the devastation given Israel's aerial power. But this is also not a situation that Israel can extract itself from with any kind of victory. I think they're going to be stuck in there also for a long time, unless there is a bigger intervention from the world to put an end to this.
Well, there's often that discussion of a 3H axis, the Houthis, Hezbollah, and Hamas. And there's also the belief, I guess, and I'd like your opinion on this, that Israel can only stretch itself so far.
Yeah, I think that is absolutely correct. They already have their hands completely full with Hezbollah. I think they thought that by decapitating the leadership and the pager attack, they've done a few things at the very beginning that were absolutely devastating to Hezbollah, but I think they underestimated the resilience of that movement, that it's bigger than a handful of leaders. Even if you decapitate the leadership, the ideological commitment of a very significant portion of Lebanon, that built this drive towards fighting for Israel as a result of Israeli occupation of Lebanon in the past. They remember what that is like, and that is a very heavily motivated population that is not going to put up with a reoccupation of Lebanon or with any kind of Israeli dominance and Israel dictating to Lebanon how it's going to behave. They're going to face very, very significant resistance going into that. So the Houthis, I think, are much farther away and much weaker in a sense. They're causing trouble primarily for them in terms of access to their, southern harbor. But that, in terms of a direct military confrontation, Hezbollah is where it's at. And potentially this bigger escalation with a direct confrontation with Iran, I think, would be absolutely devastating for the region. It has really untold consequences. And that, I think, is the really worrying sign, is there doesn't seem to be enough intervention to make sure that that does not escalate out of control, because the tit for tat is ongoing and we're all anticipating what the Iranian response is going to be in the coming days.
I want to touch briefly on the ruling of the International Court of Justice that basically Israel is heading towards, it was the way it's phrased is kind of delicate, but the word genocide came up, which caused a lot of upset for pro-Israel supporters, obviously. What were your thoughts when South Africa took that step, a very bold step?
It was an extremely bold step on the part of South Africa, and an impressive one given the fact that South Africa has nothing to gain from doing this. It's obvious that the international order is ruled by the United States for the most part, and people who are looking for their own interests would stop short of crossing certain lines. When you go after Israel with a genocide charge at the International Court of Justice, obviously that's the kind of thing that's going to shake up a significant portion of the world against you. But it was absolutely a moral imperative, and I think given their history and knowing about Israeli support for apartheid during the apartheid era in South Africa may have been part of the motivating factor. Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu and many others talked about this common struggle between South Africans and Palestinians and enduring very similar conditions. And I think that was part of why they acted with that kind of boldness. And it's a charge that frankly sticks for a simple reason. You have people like Arya Nair, who himself a Holocaust survivor, his family fled the Holocaust, started Human Rights Watch, headed the ACLU, very mainstream Jewish figure who fought for civil rights in general and for Jewish rights in particular. And he's come to the conclusion that what Israel is committing in Gaza is also a genocide. The credibility of that charge is really obvious for anybody who's not afraid to cross that line. It seems that everybody's squeamish about touching it for political reasons. But when you look at the scale of devastation in Gaza, when you look at the amount of destruction, the number of families that have been completely wiped out, and Gaza's inability to sustain life, at this point, I think this is really the only word that you can use to describe what is unfolding.
On that point, UNRWA, the UN Works and Relief Agency, is also facing the issue of now being blocked. Considering it's shifted so heavily into this humanitarian crisis, what impact do you expect from that?
Yeah, it's been absolutely devastating. I think with and without UNRWA in the short term, Israel is making it very clear that they are going to prevent Gaza from being able to sustain life in any way. They've been blocking food aid left and right, really putting the entire population of Gaza under conditions that are just unlivable. And I think that UNRWA is more about the long-term strategy of trying to end the existence of Palestinian refugees. UNRWA is the reason why Palestinian refugees can survive, can actually live day by day, awaiting the right to return to their homes and to be able to go back to the homes that they have actually come from. And Israel is interested in dismantling they're interested in dismantling the entire Palestinian national movement for freedom. And part of that is going to be chipping down at UNRWA and the ability of Palestinian refugees to survive as well.
As we kind of wrap up, a couple of quick thoughts. Where did it go wrong as far as Arab American voters in the US election?
Arab American voters understand what a threat Trump poses, but they could not bring themselves to vote for a Democratic administration that has enabled genocide for an entire year and would not even say anything about being serious about putting an end to it. And that has really shifted things in a way that is, and what's also equally impressive about it is how savvy Trump was, that he went to Michigan selling himself as the pro-peace candidate, poking fun at the Democrats, at his opponent for campaigning with Liz Cheney and talking about how the Cheneys want to destroy the Middle East and invade every Arab and Muslim country and so on. It was a level of political savviness on the Trump administration. It is frankly shocking and shameful that the Democrats did not see what an opportunity they were wasting in taking a politically smart choice that is also morally a moral imperative to oppose genocide and to gain politically from it. Instead, they chose to be on the wrong side of history and pay a very dear political price for it domestically as well.
Last thought then, you alluded to this, the risk of a wider conflict in the Middle East.
I think what Trump does when he comes in is going to very quickly tell us which direction things are heading. but that is absolutely a very, very real and serious prospect. Both Iran and Israel are committed to escalation right now. Neither of them is willing to basically bow their head down and accept the other country's dominance. And that is on a trajectory where it's going to inevitably lead to a very, very major confrontation that could pull the United States in also directly. And the question is, does the U.S. have that appetite? Because if the U.S. is committed to not engaging directly, then they would absolutely have to put an end to the way Israel is behaving in the region. This rampage that Netanyahu has gone on for an entire year has to come to an end. And if President Trump does not actually put an end to it, then it seems like it is actually inevitable. And we are looking for, at a scale of a regional configuration, that could not figuratively, but literally kill millions of people in the region. We are talking about a war that, with just the rocket arsenal that Iran has, the regional allies that they have, you're talking about the entire region being set ablaze, and it's a very, very dangerous situation.
Omar, we'll speak again, I'm sure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now let's get more on the political post-mortem with Matt Duss. He was the main foreign policy advisor to Democratic Senator Bernie Sanders. He's now Executive Vice President at the Center for International Policy. Matt Duss, thanks very much. I guess the first question is, where did the Democrats go wrong?
Well, I think there's an anti-incumbent mood both here and around the world. This has been a year with a lot of elections in democratic countries, and incumbents have not done well. There's a general mood of just dissatisfaction and kind of questioning and a lot of hostility toward the system or the establishment. And I think that's what we saw here. That's not to say that these concerns and this anger is not legitimate. I think it is. I think despite the fact that a lot of the economic indicators show that the American economy is in pretty good shape, a lot of people just aren't feeling that in their lives. The cost of living, the cost of basic goods, groceries, the cost of housing, these are rising. And clearly, American voters punish the Democrats for that.
For many years, Bernie Sanders was seen as the voice of reason for those who couldn't find, equity with either side of the Republicans or Democrats. I guess those guys are now saying we should have listened to Bernie Sanders.
Well, I mean, for the longest time, he was not seen as the voice of reason. But after, I think, 2016, yes, as you said, I mean, it became clear that someone who was himself a critic of the system and of the establishment was making a lot of the same arguments. I don't want to compare him to Trump too much, but both of them had an anti-establishment critique. I think Bernie's was obviously more unifying, I think more positive and constructive. And yes, I think in the wake of this week's defeat for Democrats, I think a lot of people are saying Bernie is onto something. So I think the question is, will the party leadership have the wisdom to really rethink, to understand what they got wrong, and really embrace that more kind of populist economic message that I think Bernie and his movement and others in the kind of populist left of the Democratic Party have been pushing?
There's also going to be the issue of winning back the lost voters. It surprised a lot of people. We had Arab American voters going one way, Black American voters, Latino American voters. There seemed to be a massive focus on these different groups and how it all shifted.
Right. No, I think that's right. I mean, we talk about Arab American voters, and we cannot not talk about Gaza. But I think that's not just an Arab American issue. I think there are a lot of Americans, particularly young Americans, including Black Americans and others, for whom Gaza is bigger than just a foreign policy issue. The issue of Palestinian rights has become part of the kind of broader progressive social justice and racial justice agenda. But I think it's also in many ways a referendum on how America behaves in the world. You have a lot of Americans who have real questions about how America has operated American foreign policy over the past several decades. Obviously, the Iraq War was a huge turning point for a lot of people, but still to watch the United States for now over a year backing almost completely unconditionally this massacre, the killing of tens of thousands of people, the displacement of over almost 2 million, that is hard for a lot of people to take. And I think the idea that we were ever going to get people to kind of disassociate these things, I think was a fantasy. And again, this goes to whether the question now is whether the Democratic Party leadership is capable of really kind of assimilating these lessons.
Now, of course, Donald Trump will position it that he's won over all these voters. But to what degree was the Arab American pro-Trump vote really a backlash, simply an anti-Biden vote or anti-Biden administration?
I think it certainly was to some extent. I think it's also worth noting, I think a lot in the Arab American community, which in this country is largely Christian rather than Muslim, although we do have a growing Muslim population. I mean, Trump brought a social conservative message. I mean, he spoke to social and religiously conservative audiences in the Arab American community and in the Latino community. Obviously, the evangelical community is very strongly pro-Trump, so I think that's a part of it as well.
So many nations around the world have had women leaders. To what degree was this a major setback for the idea of a woman U.S. president?
Yeah, I don't want to ever underestimate the element of sexism and misogyny that still certainly exists in our society. But I also don't want to overinterpret it that way. I think had Kamala Harris had a better message, had she done more work to kind of articulate a policy vision, and frankly had more time to run as the actual candidate, I think she was handicapped by both the kind of short amount of time she had to kind of get her campaign going, also the fact that she is the sitting vice president. So it was a little bit tough for her to distinguish herself from the president with whom she was still working. So I think all of those things hindered her as well.
Does she have a chance to re-enter the race at some point in the future?
I think it's probably unlikely. I think it's very rare, certainly in modern times, to see a candidate who ran and lost to come back. But I would not count it out completely, but I think it's very unlikely.
Matt, how did America become so divided?
It's been a long time coming, but I think there's a lot of reasons for it. I think growing inequality. I think the fact that a lot of Americans are struggling, they see others doing much better. They feel that the system is unfair. They see privileges and wealth accruing to a very small elite. They've become cynical about the ability of government and of basic politics to deliver policy change that impacts them. And amid that frustration, and this is historically true, people will become more susceptible to demagogues who offer them a place to point that anger, people to blame, whether it's immigrants, whether it's minorities, whether it's foreign enemies. We can go back to times throughout history where we've seen this repeatedly happening. So that's why I think it's going to be very important for Democrats to offer a better vision of how we are actually the party that can help make your lives better in a way that does not simply displace that anger onto disfavored minorities.
To some degree, this level of polarization in America, it seems unprecedented, and it doesn't feel like it could be something that's healed that quickly. Is this something now going to be generational, this divide, or could this message of unity that the candidates kept putting out actually be achieved?
Right. Well, historically we were pretty polarized. It led to the Civil War. I hope it will not lead to that again. I hope there will be a way for us to kind of reconstruct a shared concept of the American political project, because that's where we're at right now. We have, a really closely divided country, and who have, two sides that have quite different visions of what it means to be an American, what America is for, who is really an American and who is not. And I think the work, so I would agree, it is probably generational, to do the work, to kind of reach across and talk to people with whom we disagree, people with whom, who have ideas that we might find offensive, and yet with whom we share this country. But that is the task ahead of us.
I think this election, certainly for an international audience, brought up the term swing states more than ever. And I think it surprises people that there can be such a geographical division within the U.S.
Yeah, and I have to apologize to colleagues around the world who are required to pay such close attention to our elections and our swing states and our bizarre electoral college, because it does impact them. Again, this is something I think it's important for Americans to keep in mind. This election, the outcome of our elections, impacts people around the world who have no say in those elections. And so yeah, I think there are several battleground states. Trump won most, if not all of them. But I think it's because there are, both sides have their own electoral map, their, so-called path to victory. And clearly Trump's path was the better one this time.
John Bolton, who was the former U.S. ambassador to the UN and then became Donald Trump's national security advisor, and then fell out with him very badly, commented that his worry was a second Donald Trump presidency would allow Donald Trump, having realized what he could and couldn't do in the first one, to have much more power and much more focus on what he would do this time. What changes do you expect with the second Trump presidency?
Yeah, well, I think, I don't agree with John Bolton on a lot, but I do think he's right. I think Trump, in the 4 years of his first administration, Trump learned that you need to have people who are loyal to you. You need to have people who are willing to execute what you want. And I think he's done some work over these past years, clearly, to assemble a crew and a team that is more likely to do that. I mean, I think there are, in certain areas of the world, it depends what we're talking about. I think he will continue the work of the first administration. But what's interesting about this is, in a lot of areas, the Biden administration continued the work, or at least the direction of the Trump administration, starting with the focus on China, which has been the driving kind of imperative of American foreign policy, beginning with Trump. Biden has picked that up, but I think he stayed on the right side rhetorically, being careful not to, demonize Chinese or Asian Americans in a way that Trump certainly did. In the Middle East as well, too. I mean, with a few exceptions, Biden essentially carried forward what Trump was trying to do in the Middle East. And again, a lot of it driven by China, but the embrace of the Abraham Accords, seeing this as a kind of workable security and stability arrangement for the region, despite the cost and repression for the region's people. And the last thing I would say is, part of what 2016 showed us, and this is where I go back to what Bernie Sanders brought as well, was this sense that so many Americans, this system is not working for them. Our economic system, our trade system, our foreign policy. And so I think, what we did see from Biden, and this is one of the most important things, was the kind of move away from the old neoliberal kind of corporate-led global trade order. And I think there were very important steps taken to kind of try and define a new economic order that invests in American jobs, tries to rebuild American industry. But it's very easy to see how that could kind of evolve very quickly into kind of a new, trade blocks, trade war. And that is what we're going to likely see from Trump.
Now, one thing, the BRICS, or BRICS plus nations, as they've come up to be now, are a growing strength, growing strong bloc. It sounds like Donald Trump is willing to poke the bear, so to speak, in creating greater division, especially with China and perhaps with India even. What is this going to do to America's position on the world stage, particularly with trade? Yeah.
I mean, first off, I think, yes, we are already farther into a multipolar era than I think many people in Washington would like to admit. The United States obviously still enormously powerful, still has a set of partnerships and alliances that are really unmatched, yet our relative share of power is diminishing. Relative to China, relative to some of the countries, the BRICS countries that you mentioned. And I think Donald Trump has an inherent suspicion of multilateralism. We saw this goes back to his understanding of how you do business deals. He prefers kind of bilateral business deals. It's like me and you sit down and we work this out. So I think that is going to kind of undergird his attempt to kind of stoke divisions, not only in kind of alliances of adversaries, but also within alliances of allies as well.
Well, the two key factors, I guess, that could position America in the new era, apart from trade, is conflicts. And it seems that America might end up in a very difficult position when it comes to blocs taking sides, when it comes to Israel, Gaza, and also Ukraine, Russia. Can Donald Trump stop conflicts in a day, as he promises?
Right. I mean, I think, Donald Trump, I think he's shown a willingness, he uses this kind of recklessness and kind of unpredictability. And again, it looks very different when you're doing it as a real estate mogul versus president of the United States. But unfortunately, he seems to take the same approach regardless. But we did see, in his first term, that even though I think his approach led us to the brink of conflict several times, like particularly with North Korea and then later with Iran, when he's faced with the possibility of really open conflict, he has stepped back. So I think there is something in his understanding that even though he's going to use the idea of conflict to try and get a better deal, he may act rationally in that moment. Now, I think we got lucky in both of those cases. We may not get lucky again, and I think that's what's very concerning, because once you go down this path, once violence really starts to erupt, it can spiral very quickly.
What do you expect his relationship under a second presidency to be with NATO?
Yeah. I mean, I would not expect him to withdraw from NATO at the outset, but I do think he's made his views on NATO clear, and that he feels that we are getting taken for a ride. I mean, we're getting ripped off is kind of Trump's kind of general argument, and that has a lot of appeal to Americans who have questions about, the role that America has played as a sort of global security guarantor. Are we getting a benefit in comparison to how much we are paying for other security? Now, I think there is a good argument that Americans have benefited enormously from this arrangement. But Trump, particularly with NATO, the way he talks about it, I mean, I still don't know if he understands how NATO works. He seems to think that European allies pay up to us instead of like paying into their own defense. But I think, and I expect, if they didn't start to get their act together the first time, I would hope the Europeans have gotten the message now that they do need to start to think a lot more seriously about looking to their own defense. Because as I said, I don't think Trump's going to pull out of NATO immediately, but I think he's definitely going to be making noise about this. And I'll be interested to see how our European allies respond.
On the issue of the climate and climate change, he seems to be a climate change denier to many and pushing, obviously, the fossil fuel agenda. I wonder how that will affect his relationship with countries like the Middle East, which, if anything, are trying to transition away from it.
Yeah, it's a problem. I mean, for Trump, it seems very basic. He just thinks that, renewable energy and believing in climate change is bad for business. That's what it comes down to him, for him. And I think, the way that Biden has approached it, when he's, the way he says, when I hear climate change, I think green jobs, I think more jobs. That's the better way to approach it. But yeah, I think as we saw in the first term when Trump pulled out of the Paris Climate Accord, I think unfortunately we're going to see a rollback of a lot of these really important steps that were taken under the Biden administration to really starting investing in renewable energy and make a transition.
A final thought. One of my guests on my show said one of the issues that Donald Trump, one of the issues with Donald Trump is that he thinks of himself as a president, as ruler of America, not as someone who serves American citizens, as an elected leader. Is that likely, that agenda, being the ruler of America, likely to really play in?
I think so. I mean, clearly, this is, you see this in the way he's very clearly kind of admiring of more powerful dictators, whether it's Putin, whether it's Xi, leaders of other countries who have a lot more, authority to act as they want and have, populations under their control. He feels that, he felt that the first time. Now that he's been reelected, he will certainly feel it even more so. So I think we're going to see that reflected in the way he governs.
Especially with the House on his side now and changing the justice system.
That's right. This is going to be Trump unleashed.
Mantas, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And that's all for this special edition of the show, coming to you from Washington, D.C. From me and the team, thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.
At Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Arabiya News.
It's very impressive.
Where knowledge meets perspective.
Cairo, one of the world's greatest megacities, Cairo. It is rich in its historic finery, while at the same time known for its extremely hot weather, traffic, and yes, noise and air pollution. While it is perhaps the city that tourists both love and hate, the experience makes it rather worth the challenges. It's got history that spans centuries, the city is full of vigor, and Cairo is a place to be when you're looking to experience the Egyptian street life. It is, in fact, where the only surviving wonder of the ancient world is. No words can describe the majestic view of the 3 5,000-year-old pyramids on the Giza Plateau. One of the most popular ones is the King's Chamber, considered one of the deepest man-made silences on Earth. Of course, you can't miss the Sphinx. It is both an enormous sight and an overwhelming experience you will never forget. It serves as a guard of the pyramids with its lion body and pharaoh face. It is certainly an iconic monument of the ancient world. You can take hours-long camel rides to get through the pyramids. Despite the heat, dust, and other hurdles while traveling, it is definitely worth it. The Pyramids of Cheops, also called the Great Pyramid or the Pyramid of Khufu, is the largest pyramid of the Giza group. You can explore the mysterious interiors of its narrow passages. There's also the Solar Boat Museum behind it, where you will see the ceremonial solar barks that's amazingly been restored to its original glory. On the south, there's a pyramid of Kefren, which is also known as the Pyramid of Khafre. It also has an internal tunnel that invites you to explore it. Finally, there's the smaller pyramid of Mycerinus, or the Pyramid of Menkaure. When it comes to shopping, you must visit Khan el Khalili, which is considered to have one of the world's greatest shopping experiences. Its narrow alleyways have been established since 1400 AD, and up to now is still up and about with all sorts of trade, from tiny stores to cluttered workshops. For sports and recreation, find tennis courts around the south of Jazeera or ride the stables at the sports club. The Cairo Tower, built in 1961 by President Nasser, offers you an amazing view of the sunset at its observation deck.
Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive insights and fresh perspectives from leading experts and influential decision makers every weekday right here on Al Arabiya News. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up on today's program, we'll be speaking to a former ICE director who served under President Obama to learn about President-elect Trump's immigration policies as he names Tom Homan as his border czar. While Trump's intentions on immigration are clear, his NATO allies also expect him to remain committed to the alliance and continue supporting Ukraine in its conflict against Russia. And the Arab and Muslim leaders gather in the Saudi capital Riyadh for a summit addressing the wars in Gaza and Lebanon. Plus, we'll be discussing the price of Bitcoin, which has risen above the $80,000 mark for the first time ever. This follows Donald Trump's decisive victory in the US election last week. Hello and welcome to the program. The US President-elect Donald Trump has pledged to launch the largest deportation operation in the country's history. And helping him to do so is a man who's been dubbed the border czar. We're talking here about the hardline immigration official Tom Homan, whom Trump has chosen to be in charge of overseeing both the northern and southern borders, in addition to supervising maritime and aviation security in the upcoming Republican administration. Well, for more on that, we can speak now to John Sandwick, who is the former acting director of the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, better known as ICE. Now, you served under President Barack Obama. It's great to have you with us. I want to start by asking you about Tom Homan, who's also the former acting director of Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Have you worked with him at all, and what do you think he brings to the job?
Yeah, I had the opportunity to spend several years working pretty closely, actually, with Tom. Look, for what President Trump is looking for, there's no doubt Tom is the right guy. He commands a lot of respect and loyalty from the ICE agents who are out in the field. He has a long, an extensive history doing immigration enforcement, and certainly his mindset is, as you indicated, hardline, tough enforcement kind of approach. But of course, look, Tom is the mission he's trying to carry out here is going to be a very challenging one, simply because the agency, lacks the resources, and there's some serious legal challenges that the administration is going to face.
Yeah, he's going to be in charge of, quote, all deportation of illegal aliens back to their countries of origin. As I said in the intro, the largest deportation operation of undocumented migrants in the country's history. Now, this is going to be one of Trump's priorities when he gets the keys to the White House. Would you say this is, though, a case of easier said than done?
I mean, absolutely. Now, setting aside the politics and frankly, setting aside the, whether this is a good idea or not, just looking at the, what they've promised during the campaign, and then in terms of what it's going to take to actually implement that, yeah, the president faces an incredible challenge. First of all, he's inheriting an agency that's resourced to deport roughly 250 to 400,000 people. So he's going to have a massive expansion of the agency to begin with, and that's going to first take Congress giving him, significant billions and billions of dollars of increased appropriations. And then he's got to deploy that. So that means just basic things like hiring people, building, offices for them, building detention centers, all of those kind of logistics. That alone will potentially take years. But more importantly is that under U.S. law, before you can deport a migrant, they're entitled to a full and fair hearing before an immigration court. And there they can offer defenses potentially to deportation. It could be obviously asylum is one of the big ones, but it could also be that even that they're a United States citizen. The problem, though, is those courts are incredibly backlogged, and there are nowhere near enough judges to handle 11 million cases. So I think what we're also going to see is the president is going to try to find ways to bypass those courts, whether through executive orders or regulations, but basically to try to strip down the due process that these migrants are entitled to. And then obviously in doing so, he's going to face some serious legal challenges where various advocacy groups and migrants challenge his authority to do that.
So what you're saying is that even if Trump manages to find a way around some of the legal challenges and some of the legal obstacles, there's this much bigger obstacle by the sounds of things on the logistical front. Detention centres, as you say, not enough beds, not enough officials, and of course those people have all got to be trained. Would you say it's a case of the logistical obstacles being bigger than the legal ones then?
Well, I think the legal ones are ultimately going to be the most difficult for him. But yeah, I mean, look, this is just simple math. I mean, it's like anything else. The more you invest in terms of the number of agents and the number of detention beds, you need all those basic things to pull this off. And while this isn't like the it's not something you talk about on the campaign trail, but the bottom line is that even if the money was appropriated tomorrow, and first of all, he doesn't have the budget authority to hire the number of people he needs to hire, but then going out and finding them. So you're looking at an agency today that's about 6,000 to 7,000 immigration enforcement agents. They can arrest approximately 500,000 people in a year, maybe 600,000, and about 250,000 of those people are removed, are deported in that year. So you could just see how you need to, increase the size. That if you want to get just to 1 million a year, he probably needs to increase the agency fourfold. To do that, not only will require, their budget currently, ICE's budget is approximately $9 billion. So if you figure that it's going to take at least another, 3 to 4 times that, he has to get Congress to give him another, $25 billion. And even if he gets it, he needs to go out and find people who are suitable to be agents, perform background checks. They require security clearances. Then they have to go to the training academy. The system is just not built to handle this massive expansion in such a short period of time. And I know it's kind of boring and it's not something that politicians talk about on the campaign trail, but just the logistics of that make it almost an impossible task.
Tell us about the Alien Enemies Act of 1798. Now, this involves rounding up foreigners and deporting them, people who are deemed to belong to enemy countries. I mean, why is this being discussed in this particular context?
Well, as I said a minute ago, even if he was able to build the apparatus where he has enough officers to go out and arrest, these 11 million migrants or even just 1 million in a year, and he has enough detention beds, he still faces this other problem, which is the immigration courts. And the immigration courts, is where the migrants can present their claims or their defenses to deportation. And that even if there were enough judges, that process can be tedious and a little bit slow. It's a legal process. So what the president and his advisors are doing is they're looking for ways to get around that legal process. And one thing they've seized on is this Alien Enemies Act. And as you indicated, it's a 1798 law that was passed that gives the president during the time of war the authority to declare individuals who are citizens of countries with whom we're at war, the power to detain them or deport them unilaterally, basically without due process. So why this has come up is because, look, Tom Homan, other advisors who are working for the president, Stephen Miller, they know that even if they were able to arrest everybody, they run right into this problem in the courts. So they're looking for ways to get around it, and they're seizing upon this as a possible path. Now, look, this is going to get challenged in a U.S. court. I'm not sure that the application that President Trump is looking potentially to use it for is going to survive legal review. I mean, the times it's been used, it's been incredibly controversial and probably, including the internment of Japanese American citizens during World War II, something the United States later apologized for and paid reparations to the families of those people. Even if he was able to deploy it, though, like that, it was only been used in times of actual war. So I think what would happen here is the president would claim that we're at some sort of war with, with all these countries invading us with their migrants from, Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala. I just am not confident in any way that it's going to survive an ultimate legal review. But of course, this is, I think, what we can expect, a lot of very aggressive and novel kind of approaches to immigration enforcement, followed quickly by legal challenges and injunctions. And, it's what we saw 4 years ago.
Yeah, so just moving on and wrapping up that point about that Alien Enemies Act. I mean, basically, it sounds as though, okay, we know the act from the context you described, the Second World War, the Japanese and German Americans being put in internment camps. And as you say, that was a time of war. But short of declaring war on all of the countries from whom these people come and then deporting them to them or interring them, this simply wouldn't have any application in this particular context. Does that roughly sum it up?
That roughly sums it up, yeah. And look, the challenge here, too, is that the number of nations we're seeing today at our U.S. border, dozens of nations, whether it's Russians, Chinese, Haitians, El Salvadorans, the list goes on and on. You can't readily declare war against all those individuals. And again, because of, look, I got to tell you, the context with which this was used in the past is obviously extremely controversial. So there's a political element to this as well. Frankly, that's a larger concern with all of his plans, is that when you look at the demographics of who these 11 million undocumented immigrants in the United States are, you see a couple of things quickly. One is, they've been here a long time. They've lived in this country. That means they've developed ties. They go to churches in America. They work at jobs with other Americans. They have, they're integrated in our community. But also they have U.S. citizen family members. They've often had children where they've married U.S. citizens. They can't fix their own immigration status, but their families are citizens. And so if you get to 11 million, by definition, you're starting to separate those families or rip those families apart. Politically, I just don't know, if the United States has the appetite, even if he could pull off the Alien Enemies Act, for the construction of mass detention camps where we start ripping the mothers of, young U.S. citizen children out and putting them in those camps. I don't know if we really have the appetite for that in this country.
There's a suggestion that the military could have a role in all of this. Do you see that as being a possible route to go down, enlisting the help of the army?
Yeah, I think, look, he's looking again at these two big challenges. One is the due process challenge, and that's why he's looking at things like the Alien Enemies Act. And then he's looking at this logistical challenge I referenced at the outset. So he's trying to figure out ways, how do I ramp up the number of agents quickly? How do I build detention beds quickly? So I think, yeah, he's going to look at using the military, and he's looking at probably also at state and local law enforcement, one thing we haven't talked about, but as trying to get local police, local sheriff's deputies to get involved in immigration enforcement. Look, from a short-term perspective, it'll provide a boost to the agency, and it certainly can increase the number of arrests, and certainly probably they could build some low-cost, quick detention centers on military bases. But it's not going to solve his bigger logistics problem, which is he still is going to need tens of billions of dollars of federal immigration agents. There's only so much that military officers can do. They can watch the border, they can stand guard over detainees. Maybe there's a little bit more he could get them to do. Certainly there's more that he could get state and local police to do, but ultimately these might maybe make his logistical problem a little easier, but they certainly aren't going to solve it. But again, a lot of this is, I hate to say it, but it's political theater, right? He wants to make it look like he's doing everything possible to take on undocumented immigration in this country, and using the military obviously is a very powerful symbol of the president's commitment to doing that.
And when it comes to a template, a blueprint for doing something of this nature, I mean, there are a couple of examples, parallels that can be drawn The British government tried to deport a number of migrants to Rwanda, the so-called Rwanda plan. The Italians have done that with some success in an arrangement with Albania. But would you say either of those had been a template that perhaps the Trump administration would want to take note of and perhaps learn some lessons from?
He might. So one thing to keep in mind is that, a lot of this mass deportation plan has been focused on the 11 million people who already live in the United States. But that's not all that's getting pulled on the immigration services in the United States. Obviously, we still have a significant number of people crossing the border. And although those numbers are way down, you still have 50,000 new asylum cases at the border every single month. You also have people who are legally present. They were here they were given permanent residency or a work visa, and then they get convicted of a crime while they're here. Those people are also queued up for deportation. So at the border, though, he needs to, obviously, most pressing, politically important to him is he's promised day one to solve the border crisis. I think what he's going to try to do first, before he starts looking at plans like the Rwanda plan that the British tried, the UK tried, I think what he's going to try to do is implement a rule again where he says, okay, if you have a right to make an asylum claim in the United States, but you don't have to wait for your hearing in the United States, we're going to push you into Mexico and make you wait in Mexico. He did this during his first administration to some success, and the Mexicans were remarkably flexible with him in terms of allowing large numbers of people who are not Mexican citizens to continue to wait in Mexico. It'll be interesting to see. It's a new presidency, of course, in Mexico. It'll be interesting to see if they continue to allow this. But I think first he'll try something which is similar, but again, it's just you cross the border from Mexico, you stay in Mexico. One day you get a hearing in the United States, but you wait there. And by wait, I mean years. But I wouldn't be surprised if that falls apart or if that fails and he can't get control of the border. If he does start looking for something similar to that, where you can find a third country that's willing to take people back. He certainly tried some similar things, but on a much smaller scale during the first administration. But again, I think the first approach will be Mexico. And if that fails, start looking at some of these other options.
And I'm wondering whether you think he might get pushback from his own party, the Republican Party, because, of course, if you take out 1 million perhaps low-skilled people from the US workforce, there will be potentially, won't there, a shortage of labor for doing some of the jobs that are needed to keep the economy ticking along. I mean, in the UK with Brexit, there was the issue of fruit pickers who came from different parts of Europe who suddenly went around, and that had an impact on the agricultural sector. Do you think this could end up having an impact on sections of the UK economy, of the US economy, and therefore somewhat backfiring?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, all the economists and all the data and all the studies out there demonstrate that these people provide a critical low-wage workforce in this country. And probably, look, the situation at the border, I understand why people were so frustrated in the United States, but there's also an element to this where it brought in a large number of low-wage workers who probably helped keep inflation or reduced inflation a bit and helped us kind of stop inflation in this country. Look, I think what's a good example, though, is in the first Trump administration when he did this family separation. And I don't know if you remember this, but when families would come across the border seeking asylum, they started a plan where they took the parents and criminally prosecuted them and separated them from their children. And horrifically, to this day, some of those children are still not reunited with their parents. But he did face an immediate backlash, including from within his own party, and he backed off of it. So I think as this goes forward, if he really actually is able to start reducing the undocumented population in this country, I think the business community is going to complain because we just don't have a program in this country, a legal visa program that gives them all the workers they need in agriculture, in meatpacking, in construction. But you think you're going to get backlash on the humanitarian element. And that's what happened in his first administration, is, as I said at the outset, if you start deporting 11 million people, you're separating families that include U.S. citizens. And I'm not entirely sure that even the Republican Party understands the ramifications of that. And as they start to see it play out in real time, I'm not convinced that he's not going to get a lot of pushback from within the party for that.
Yeah, and during the campaign trail, we heard quite a lot of rhetoric on this issue. I mean, it was the most important issue on voters' minds throughout the campaign. But we heard the Trump campaign using language like poisoning the blood of the United States. There is an invasion, quote, of people entering the United States. Just looking at that poisoning the blood comment, I mean, I just want to ask your opinion, and this is the last question we have time for, unfortunately, but is there evidence that immigrants and undocumented migrants are indeed more likely to commit crimes?
All the data suggests that the immigrant communities actually commit crime at a lower rate than the general lawful, legally present population. So the answer, look, there are some bad actors in this country. There's some transnational gang members who are here unlawfully, who are operating and committing horrific crimes. There are already, every year ICE arrests 150,000 people who committed crimes in the United States who have, either were on a visa or have no legal status at all. I'm not saying that there isn't immigrant crimes, but writ large, the overwhelming majority of migrants who come to this country are seeking a better life for them and their families. That doesn't mean that they're allowed to stay here, but the idea that they are here and that's just creating this plague of crime is not borne out by all of the data, which does indicate that the immigrant community commits crimes at a lower rate than the rest of the country.
Okay, well, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. John Sandberg, thank you very much indeed.
My pleasure.
Now, when asked if support for Ukraine had waned since Donald Trump's victory, the British Defence Minister John Healey said he expected the incoming Trump administration to remain committed to NATO and to Ukraine for as long as was necessary. While Russia remains a US adversary, Trump has maintained dialogue with President Vladimir Putin, a move that has raised eyebrows domestically, but reflecting his distinct approach to both his allies and his adversaries. Well, earlier, the Washington Post reported a phone call between the two leaders had taken place, during which Trump reportedly urged Putin not to escalate the war in Ukraine. However, the Kremlin has dismissed that report, calling it, quote, pure fiction. Well, for more on the matter, we can speak to Greg Swenson, who's the chair of Republicans Overseas UK. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. I just want to know what you make of the reports of that call between the two men and whether you think it's consequential or not.
Yeah, I'm not sure it's consequential yet. And of course, you never believe anything you hear from the Kremlin. So I'm not sure I'd pay too much attention to their statements. But I do. It is clear that President Trump, he's a disruptor. And I think the word you chose, his distinct way of doing these things surely is. So I think that, he wants to end this war. There's no doubt about that. That's been very clear. Exactly how he does it will probably be a mystery for now. And I don't think he wants to really tell the world how he's going to do it. That would sort of defeat the whole purpose of it. So I think what is clear is that he wants to end the war.
Yeah, I mean, a lot has been made out of the message that a Trump victory makes and sends to Moscow. Do you think there's too much that's being made of that? And if so, and if not, what do you think the message is that Trump's victory sends to the Kremlin?
Well, I think it sends a message to the world that it probably will be a safer place because Trump is back in the White House, and that even people that didn't miss Trump, they surely missed the peace and prosperity of those years. So I think we can expect that, this will not be a forever war like we've had in the last 20 years. And that's really important to President Trump and his base and the 53% of Americans that voted for him, for that matter. So, I think it's really important that he ends the war or does his best to end the war. Ultimately, it's up to Putin, and I don't think President Trump can just, flip the switch and end this thing. I think there has to be some negotiating, and a lot of parties might be unhappy with, no one's going to be perfectly thrilled with the outcome. But I do think that there's merit to President Trump getting involved in trying to end this thing.
Indeed. I mean, there are a lot of concerns, though, about at what price peace could come. And, people saying, pursuing a policy of getting a deal done could come with a very high price, namely Ukraine having to cede land to Russia, which invaded their country illegally in their view. I mean, do you think that is, though, the price that has to be paid to end this war?
I think ultimately there has to be some compromise, and it's not pleasant. No, everybody wants Ukraine to win. It's just that right now it doesn't look like they can. I think the incrementalist approach to, from the Biden administration, of sort of drip feeding support and weapons over time that didn't really enable, the Ukrainians to to either win or at least defend themselves in a better way than they were able to. So, but I don't think that, we can't turn back the clock, right? I don't think that escalating at this point is wise. So I think it's very clear, if President Trump is making it clear to Putin not to escalate, I don't think Putin will. And I think he made that clear to him in 2019 and 20. And you didn't see much movement from Putin. So, we also have to remind ourselves to not just look at or listen to what President Trump says or what the press says he says, which is always two different things, but also look at what he does. And I think the way he came into office and immediately imposed sanctions on Nord Stream 2, he immediately sent lethal weapons, including Javelin missiles, to Ukraine. After the Biden and Obama years, where they were sending non-lethal weapons, blankets and MREs, to a U.S. airbase in Poland, and then trucking them in commercial trucks to Kyiv, because both Obama and Biden were afraid of offending Putin in some way. And I don't think Trump ever really feared Putin at all. And you could see it in the way he handled things, again, with sanctions, with shipping lethal weapons. So you could even make the same argument for how he handled Iran. And day one, Biden came in and started appeasing Iran and not enforcing the sanctions. And so in both cases, you've seen a President Trump that's done what's right in terms of relations with Russia. Keep your friends close and your enemies closer. But at the same time, he would not have advocated the Biden policy of increasing oil prices by being hostile to our own energy sector, and then having Jake Sullivan go to Moscow and beg Putin to pump more oil. It's kind of a humiliating moment for the U.S. when Jake Sullivan was doing that, National Security Advisor, of course. So, that, of course, was before the invasion of Ukraine. But it just demonstrates how weak and the Biden administration was, and how they were really appeasing our adversaries, both Russia, Iran, and others. So I think it'll be a refreshing return to have President Trump back in.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, President Trump has said he can end this war in 24 hours. But there could be those who argue that that's not necessarily strategically the best way to go about ending this war. The best way to go about ending it would surely be to negotiate with Russia when Russia's in a perceived position of weakness on the battlefield, not using an artificial 24-hour time frame.
Yeah, I do think sometimes he exaggerates the 24 hours, although it won't necessarily be 24 hours starting on January 20th. It's really starting now. And so I think there's a chance that it can happen, and quickly. But also that point of Russian weakness, that's probably passed as well. I mean, there were probably moments during the last 2.5 years would have been a better time to negotiate from a position of strength. We all wish we could turn the clock back and do things differently, but I don't think I don't think it's wise to wait another 2 years, because more people are going to die between now and then. So, I don't think anybody, and especially this administration, wants war. He's used military strength, tactically and temporarily, and he's used it wisely. You saw that with the terminating General Soleimani in Iran back in early 2020. You've seen it in how he handled the Russians in Syria. He actually had, U.S. troops actually killed Russian soldiers in Syria. So these are moments where Trump's disruptive nature and his sort of unfiltered, or non-traditional methods, at least in what he says and the way he negotiates, it is new. He is disruptive, but in many ways, it's what he does that's really important. And people, again, they miss the peace that we had in his administration. And I think in many respects, he's coming into a world that's a much more dangerous place than the one he left in 2020. But I do think he is, a man of peace and wants peace. And if he has to talk, Zelensky or Putin into compromises, so be it. I think what's clear, though, there will be very, very strict, agreements that Putin has to uphold. And I think, it's the old Ronald Reagan line, trust but verify. I think it would be he'll have serious conditions for any kind of a peace deal that Russia cannot cross certain red lines. And Trump will be very serious about that.
Okay, and so if indeed Donald Trump and President Vladimir Putin did speak in the last 24 hours, you wouldn't necessarily say that was the beginning of the 24-hour window for ending this conflict?
No, that would be, somewhat of a miracle. But I do think, yes, that's a funny way of President Trump to describe his interest, that he is. I think what we should take from that is not take it literally that it will happen in 24 hours, but that he's quite serious about this. And I think it was, it's important for him to point that out. It's important for him to recognize that, there were no wars, major wars started under him. And remember, the invasion of Crimea in 2014 was under Obama, Biden. And of course, the invasion of other parts of Ukraine were under, Biden, Harris. So I think if we look at his track record on this particular topic and many others, people look back and think, okay, things were a lot better then. And the president and the administration will do their best to return the world to the peace we had in those days.
And when it comes to NATO, what sort of a change might the advent of another Trump presidency bring with regards to the strength of that alliance and how much support it gets from Washington?
Yeah, Tom, it's a great question, and it will be a much stronger alliance for one reason. Yes, you'll have a continuation of the argument that the countries in NATO, the European countries, should meet their commitment of 2% of GDP. You're seeing that we're possibly up to 21 countries by the end of this year. So that progress should continue. But more importantly, it's defense spending in the U.S. It's rebuilding the military. He did that in his term. And even though his rhetoric is a little disruptive and the way he delivers these things is, not exactly diplomatic at times, but when he dressed down the Germans in 2018, he wasn't very polite about it. It was something, they hadn't heard that kind of language from a president or a leader, but he was right. And it worked at least for some of the other countries in NATO. It hasn't worked terribly well with the Germans. They're still lagging. And as the biggest economy in Europe, they shouldn't be. But
actually, sorry, just to interrupt you there, Greg, and this is a really interesting point that was made by the German Foreign Minister, Annalena Baerbock, who said, in fact, the 2% spend of GDP on defense might actually not even be enough. That's by the Germans' own admission.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And look, I think all the countries need to spend more. The UK is doing their part, at 2.5%. And so they're playing above their weight. But I think what's really important to remember, yes, we want the Europeans to spend more. There's no doubt. But remember, Joe Biden cut defense spending in the U.S. 3% a year for 3 years, probably including year 4. We'll see the same sort of reduction. And that should be worrisome to NATO and to our European allies. And that is completely destructive in terms of the alliance and the strength of the alliance. So, we'll see Trump come in and increase defense spending and do the things that should have been done the last 4 years. He did it in his first term. That's, a 9% cut in 3 years. That's 4.5% of the total NATO defense spending. That's what we should be worried about. So, and if Biden or if Harris had won, or either one of them, the defense spending in the U.S. would be down to 2.4% by 2030. Right now, it's just under 3%. That is not enough. We need to get it back to 4, 5, 6%. And that's better for our allies. It's better for the world.
Okay. Greg Swenson, Chair of Republicans Overseas UK. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Moving on now, in his statement at the Arab Islamic Summit in Riyadh, the Lebanese Prime Minister Najib Mikati declared that his country is facing a historic existential crisis which threatens Lebanon's present and future. He also emphasized that Israel cannot continue its aggression and violations of Lebanon's sovereignty without accountability, whilst calling for a strengthened Lebanese army presence in the south to assert the state's authority over the border. So, how close are we to a ceasefire in Lebanon? Well, to discuss this, I'm joined once again here on Arabiya News by the former Prime Minister of Lebanon, Fouad As-Sinora. Thank you very much indeed for joining us once again, Prime Minister. We've heard from the current, the caretaker Prime Minister, Najib Mikati, speaking at the Arab League and Organization of Islamic Cooperation in Riyadh. He said, as I said in the intro, Lebanon going through an unprecedented crisis. What was he seeking to achieve by making those comments? Is that a call for help?
First of all, good day, and thank you for inviting me to speak to you. And actually, I endorse what the Prime Minister Najib Mikati has said. Well, definitely, we are passing through an existential crisis. And in fact, Lebanon is really suffering from this very bad situation, not only in terms of the number of casualties and the number of injured, which is quite significant, but at the same time, with the extent of damage and the destruction, and the extent of suffering of the very large number of Lebanese who have been forced and to be displaced from their villages and towns, and they are everywhere, scattered everywhere in the country, which is definitely much graver than the situation that we experienced in 2006, and in terms of numbers of displaced, as well as in terms of casualties and injured, and the extent of destruction. It is definitely a call for the need for an immediate call for a ceasefire, permanent ceasefire, and at the same time, a call for help. And at the same time, it is a call for all the Lebanese factions to understand that it is very important for them to agree and immediately to call for a meeting by the Speaker of the House in order to elect a president. It cannot continue as such, and actually Lebanon now is in the 25th month without electing a president. So far, this problem is there, and we have to really find a solution. For sure, that what is supposed that the Arab and Islamic Summit to do is to support Lebanon in its call for help in terms of putting more pressure so that an immediate ceasefire can really be taken and to hold, and at the same time for arranging for immediate help for really taking care of the very large number of displaced people. And we are in winter, unlike what was the case in 2006 during summer. And this in winter, it is very difficult to really house this number of people under very difficult weather conditions. And at the same time, there is a need to consider what's to be done after. For sure, there is an important thing to be done at the level of Lebanon. At the level of Lebanon, it's very important for the Lebanese to come together and to decide very clearly and firmly that Lebanon will implement in all its provisions the Security Council Resolution 1701. Actually, I was there in 2006 as Prime Minister, and effectively, Israel did not really make sure to implement this resolution, and Hezbollah at the same time was not sincere and to implement this resolution. Now we are all witnessing the result of this let's say laxity and non-firmness in taking let's say the necessary decision to implement. But effectively, let me add something in here, is that not only the problem started in 2006, and definitely the problem did not start on the 7th of October 2023. The problem that we are facing still taking different shapes and different versions of it, which is the inability so far to find a real solution to the problem of the Palestinians. You cannot have, let's say, a permanent, just peace if we cannot really make all the necessary effort in order to come to the crux of the problem. The Palestinians still looking to really put their need to have a state for them that really recognize their identity as Palestinians. Sure. And this is the problem that has been really moving from one year into another as well from 1948 and effectively in 1990 and in 1991, you remember that we had the Madrid Conference, we had the Oslo Agreement, and all these, let's say, Security Council and United Nations resolutions have not been implemented. To the contrary, things have been dragging, and with nothing really being implemented. The Arab summit that took hold in 2002 in Beirut, the Arab Peace Initiative was issued then, and still it is not implemented. Okay. In addition to this, the summit that was held exactly a year ago, on the 11th of November 2023, if we look at it today, actually all the provisions of this resolution that was made by the Arab and Islamic Summit, nothing of it has been implemented.
And just turning our eye to the current summit. Sorry to interrupt you. The summit happening in Riyadh. We've got 22 members of the Arab League there, 57 members of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. I mean, Lebanon's prime minister is surrounded by friends, isn't he? I mean, there's overwhelming support in that room in Riyadh for your country, isn't there?
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, I don't deny that. You see, the support for Lebanon is fine. But I'm saying what has been really said about in 2023 regarding Israel. Israel has not implemented anything. That's what I'm referring to.
Sure.
I'm not referring to the help of the Arabs. To the contrary, I think the Arabs have been really standing by the side of Lebanon and want to support Lebanon, and they really are after for the implementation of an immediate ceasefire.
And on that note, Prime Minister, I mean, I want to ask you about the ceasefire and the progress towards it, because we're getting some confusing messages from both sides. We're being told by the Israeli side that a ceasefire proposal has, in fact, been discussed and approved, but Hezbollah saying they haven't received it. I mean, why do you think we're getting these two very different messages on that front?
Well, actually, I mean, this is exactly, I am really disturbed about this matter because we haven't seen anything of the sort, and I haven't heard from the Prime Minister any indication that he has received any proposal in this regard. It seems that there is some sort of a difference of opinion actually within the Israeli government in this regard. But anyhow, there are some let's say statements that are being made here and there referring to something that has to be issued or has to be declared, which we are not aware of. Anyhow, what we really are after is that there should be a ceasefire, and there should be an implementation of 1701, and there should be a new president and a new government that takes the responsibility of the implementation and the full implementation of 1701. Because with what we have now, we don't have a president and we don't have a full functioning government. We have a caretaker government which is not able to really do anything what it is required to do.
But it does seem like a lot's happening, because we've got that summit in Riyadh. There's the talk of the ceasefire happening, with a proposal being put forward by Israel, although we're not sure on the status of it. And then we've also heard from Hezbollah, the spokesperson Mohammed Afif, saying that since the election of Donald Trump, he says, last week, there have been contacts between Washington, Moscow, Tehran, and other capitals. I'm wondering what you make of that. Do you think that's true? And if it is true, does it make you optimistic?
Well, I look forward. Let me put it this way. I don't like to use the word optimistic or pessimistic. I look forward that there should be a decision to be taken. It is not in the interest of all. I mean, on the Arab side, Israeli side, on the Western Front, in terms of United States and other European countries and other countries in the world, including Russia, including China. They are all after. But, I mean, there is still a distance between the will and the readiness to push towards the implementation of such a resolution and making sure to be respected at the same time. So this is where we are, you see, in this respect. There has been differences in opinion, it seems, in Israel, which we have seen, you see, and everybody knows that there was let's say a resolution was some sort of let's say adopted by 10 countries, including the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar, and others, about the implementation of a ceasefire for 60 days, and during which so many things can take place. And actually, what really happened, although Israel expressed its opinion at that time, it is going to accept it, and all of a sudden they decided not to, and you know what really happened afterwards. So this is where we are now.
Okay.
Is that there has been a great deal of talking, but without any implementation on behalf of Israel.
But you haven't reacted to something that was said in that statement by the Hezbollah spokesperson. He said, since the election of Donald Trump last week, and I'm just wondering whether you think, viewed from Beirut, the change of administration in the United States, which admittedly is still 70 days away, whether you think that's going to change anything, whether you think that's likely to change the dynamic.
Yes, I tend to think that let's say some players, let's say probably on the Israeli side, there might be an interest by the Israeli government and by Netanyahu himself is to stall and not to really move towards something if he can. I mean, if he doesn't receive major pressures from the present administration of the United States. So, I mean, he is betting that he might have a situation might be different. Although President-elect Trump has been saying that I want this to finish before I even assume my responsibilities. So this is on behalf of the Israeli side. On behalf of the Iranian side, which up till now is really has a role to play, in fact, they may tend to think that it might be better to arrive at a solution now with the present administration and not with the upcoming one, particularly that President-elect has been saying, I'm going to resort to excessive, let's say, sanctions. So maybe interested to get into a decision now. So this is as far as Iran, and as far as all the Arab world, as far as Lebanon and the Lebanese are definitely for arriving in an immediate ceasefire. The same thing is definitely for Hezbollah, unless actually they might be pressured otherwise by the Iranians.
I mean, talking about Hezbollah, it's really interesting to hear what the Israeli Defense Minister, Israel Katz, has said about Hezbollah. They said, he says that they are defeated. Do you think that's actually the case?
Let me tell you something. You see, definitely this is what the Israelis want to say. And this is the one to say that in order to justify their position vis-a-vis their, let's say, the Israeli public opinion. Actually, let me tell you something, and we have to be very careful about it. Hezbollah is definitely deep-rooted in Lebanon among his supporters. And as you know, during that period, he has made it a point to convince the people that he is the defender of Lebanon and a good part of the Lebanese and the Shiites in general. And besides that, I consider, this is my estimate, is that the presence of Hezbollah in Lebanon is not only, let's say, among those who are on the military side. They have a large number of military people, but they have a large number among, let's say, the various institutions that they have created over the last years. I mean, social, medical institutions, let's say, educational institutions, at the same time business ones, and so on. I tend to think that there might be, among all the various institutions that they have created, military as well as civil institutions, there are about 80,000 in the payroll. So that's why they have a major support. I mean, what we're speaking, 80,000 on the payroll, it means about 350,000 people are depending on Hezbollah. So this is something that one should not forget. And in this regard, what is important is to really try to approach this situation from a different point of view, other than considering that they are finished. They are not finished. And it is very important to look at matters from an angle that really bring the supporters of Hezbollah back to the Lebanese state. They have to really behave accordingly, that there is the only way for survival is to get back to the state. I was visiting this morning the high spiritual leader, Adil Khatib, of the Islamic Shiite institutions. And the first statement that he has made today in front of me, and he issued it, that they are actually dependent on the state, and to be the state the sole decision maker in Lebanon. So this is very important situation. The problem now is, unlike what some people say, that Hezbollah is finished and let's try to see how we can we can deal with that situation.
Yeah, Hezbollah certainly doesn't sound like they think they're finished. They've been saying Hezbollah doesn't sound like they feel they're finished. They've been saying, that same spokesperson says, we are, quote, ready for a long war. But I wanted to move on from Hezbollah and ask you about something else, because we were talking about the Israeli Defense Minister, Israel Katz, and some of the comments he's been making there. He says as well that he hopes that Lebanon will join other countries in normalizing relations with Israel. I mean, that feels still, doesn't it, like a very long way off, doesn't it?
A very long way off. Let me say. What he's saying, Hezbollah, I mean, what is by the Israeli minister, it is his interest in saying so. What the spokesman of Hezbollah, again, it is his interest in saying that we are for a long war, we are ready for this and that. I mean, let's look at it wisely, and let's have our feet on the ground. They have been, let's say, getting a major blow. We have to understand that. But not to the extent that if they are finished. They are not finished. And it is not in the interest of anybody to really make major wrong assumptions that will end up that is not in the interest of anybody. I think what is important is that to really embrace Hezbollah under the let's say the authority of the state, to bring them together and to really find solutions for them, particularly finding a solution for 1.2 million that have been displaced and they have to go back to their villages. So we have to really again bring things in order to have such a thing administered by the Lebanese state with the donors, by solely the Lebanese state and the donors, and no intervention by Hezbollah and others, or Amal, whatever it is, in order to embrace these people and let them believe and that they have no other place to go other than the Lebanese state to become the sole decision maker in the country. This is what I believe. I believe that more, what do you call it, confidence building measures they have to be taken in Lebanon, and at the same time an understanding that there is nothing that can be done other than going back to the state. And in this regard, we have to really give recognition to the Taif agreement in the second part of it, which states very clearly that the Lebanese state should collect all the weapons of all from the various militias in the country. So this is, again, the implementation of the Taif agreement should be a heading to respect.
All right, just one last question, very briefly, if you will, Mr. Senior. I want to ask you about the admission by the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on Sunday. For the first time, he says Israel was responsible for the pager attacks 2 months ago, the attacks which, of course, targeted Hezbollah members. I mean, let's be clear, no one was really in any doubt as to who was behind that, were they?
No, actually, I mean, there has been leakage from so many places that they are the ones who did it, and effectively, I mean, let's really set aside the various convictions of people who really want to side with Israel and others on the other side. What Israel has been doing in this war is something that has not been seen during this century and the last century. I mean, the extent of humanitarian crimes that have been taken and the extent of suffering that they have and are still up till this point in time. You just have to listen to the people who are in the northern part of Gaza. There is a problem, starvation, a problem. People are without really any medical, any social support, any coverage of, let's say, even basic things are not available. They are really major suffering. It cannot continue like this. And what we have been seeing in Gaza, we are seeing some of it now in Lebanon. This cannot continue as such. The world cannot really stay silent while all these crimes, humanitarian crimes, that are being committed. Okay. That's the most important message that should reach the world. Something has to be done, and to be done soon. And Lebanon has to be saved, and it can be saved. Okay. Well, thank you very much. We really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Former Prime Minister of Lebanon, Fouad As-Signora. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much. Well, during his campaign, Donald Trump made repeated claims that he could end the war in Ukraine, although he did not specifically say how he intended to achieve this. Well, joining us now to help us understand Trump's plan to end the conflict is Jim Townsend, the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for European and NATO policy under the Obama administration. Well, joining us to try and shape a prospect of Trump's plan to end the war in Ukraine is Jim Townsend, the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for European and NATO policy in the Obama administration. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. I just want to ask you, what does Donald Trump's victory change, in your opinion, with regards to Washington's support for Kyiv?
Well, it changes it a lot, unfortunately. You can bet for sure that the kinds of assistance going to Ukraine under the Biden administration and even under the Obama administration will not at all be at that level, if at all. There could be an absolute embargo on assistance unless Trump wants to use it as leverage. So that's the first thing. And the second thing that's changed is that Trump is very serious about trying to come up with peace, if you will, between Russia and Ukraine. He said he could do it in 24 hours. I'm not sure about that. But already there are around town all these ideas for some type of agreement between Ukraine and Russia that really would be at the expense of Ukraine and rewarding Russia for bad behavior.
Yeah, interesting to hear the Germans saying that the war is, quote, in a decisive phase, and calling for more munitions, more support to be given to Ukraine. I'm just wondering, what you read into those words, decisive phase. What makes this a decisive phase?
Well, I think that's very interesting, too. On the battlefield, we are seeing that Ukraine has not been able to really muster the counteroffensive that we were hoping to see over the last year or so. It looks like in Kursk now, which is where they did take the war to Russia, it looks like there are thousands of not just Russian, but also North Korean troops that are getting ready to try to push the Ukrainians out of Russia and back into Ukraine. And then on the Eastern Front, the Russians have been chipping away at the Ukrainian line there. And so right now the battlefield doesn't look good for Ukraine. They're hanging in there. It's not a rout. We're not seeing such an decisive moment on the battlefield. It's a war of attrition right now. But I think what we're seeing is politically, there's a decisive moment about what's going to happen when Trump becomes president and what he tries to broker in terms of Ukraine and Russia.
Of course, there are another 70 days or so to go until Donald Trump does become president again. A lot could happen during that time. Or conversely, nothing will happen during that time, because we all know from covering this war for a couple of years now that the winter months are pretty quiet on the battlefront. Everyone's sort of frozen into their positions and the ground is hard as iron. I'm just wondering whether you think there's any advantage in striking now with regards to the peace process, some sort of negotiation process, or whether it can simply wait until January and for that not to make an awful lot of difference.
Well, it's an interesting point. I think the Russians are going to want to get the Ukrainians out of Kursk before any kinds of talks start. They don't want a Ukrainian chip on the table, which is, Kursk. And they want to make sure that they are in a better position when it comes to any kind of talks. So I think they probably are seeing that the momentum for talks is suddenly starting to move. And if they want to make sure they're in a better place, the Russians want to get Ukraine out of Kursk. So I think no matter the weather, I think they're going to try to move forward. I think that, again, as I mentioned earlier, surprisingly, it's only been, not even a week since the election, and already you're hearing terms being thrown around and phone calls that had or had not taken place between Trump and Putin or Trump and Zelensky and what was discussed. So there's already talk about some type of peace agreement. And so that's moving quickly. And I'm not sure that will wait for the winter either. In the U.S., we look at the first 100 days of an administration to judge them, a new administration. And so it could be that Trump wants to have on the board some kind of a, agreement, or at least a way ahead with Ukraine, Russia, which means he's going to have to really make a lot of headway after January 20th, which is when he's going to be inaugurated. But already, as I said, there are ideas floating around out there. So I think no matter what's going to happen on the battlefield and no matter the winter, this is going to start moving quickly. And we'll just have to see what we end up with within the next few months. But it looks like it's on the move.
Do you think there's any dialogue taking place between the outgoing Biden administration and the incoming Trump administration on how best to proceed? Because, it could be argued that the best thing that could happen for all concerned is for Ukraine to be given maximum support during these next 70 days until Donald Trump becomes president, to give them a maximum number of bargaining chips to put on the table, and then for Donald Trump to be able to take the credit for having struck a deal when he does take office in January. Do you think that sort of sounds a bit like wishful thinking?
Well, no, because I think Biden right now is pushing as much out the door as he can. And of course, for Trump, that assistance can be used as leverage, too. He could use that as leverage with the Ukrainians, saying, if you're not going to be willing to cut a deal, I'm going to pull back this assistance. He could also turn to the Russians and say, if you're not going to play ball and come up with some compromises here, we're going to double the amount of assistance that goes to Ukraine. So, the assistance can be used as leverage in various ways by Trump. But no matter what Trump thinks, the Biden folks are pushing it out the door. And in terms of dialogue or any kind of discussion between the Trump folks and the Biden administration, I don't think so. I don't think the Trump. Well, number one, there's not a lot of Trump people who have been empowered to talk to the Biden administration. They haven't been chosen, and also I don't think it's kind of the Trump way to have a lot of dialogue with the outgoing presidency and those people. I think there's no love lost between those two, and so I think Trump is moving ahead with what he wants to do, come hell or high water.
Not even on foreign policy. I mean, we can understand that perhaps on domestic issues, major campaign pledges that have more of a domestic impact. But when it comes to foreign policy, I mean, surely you'd have thought that foreign policy and foreign interests would sort of supersede party politics.
No, because the way Trump has said and Vance have said, they're looking at the American role in the world. And how we conduct ourselves in a very different way than the Biden people do, and a very different way than most of the presidents before Biden looked at foreign policy. I mean, you're right in terms of our past history. You would have had some discussions during the transition and transition papers. When I was in the government, we had to write transition papers about what we were doing so that the incoming group would have at least a transition book that they could see what was going on and what they might want to do about it. But I don't think in this case there's any desire on the Trump people to hear from the Biden folks about what they're doing and what they need to watch out for. I think the Trump people say, we don't care what your views are and what you have done. We're not going to do anything along the lines that you have moved in the past. And we're going to move ahead according to what Donald Trump has already said in the press. And on the campaign trail, and we're going to do whatever he tells us to do now. So I don't see a lot of freelancing during this transition. I don't see a whole lot of dialogue. I can see a lot of civil servants writing transition papers that will never be read. And then we'll have to see what Trump is going to put into action. Obviously, he already has a plan, and he is beginning to work that right now. And so after January 20th, he'll be authorized to actually put these plans into motion.
Indeed, and I just want to ask you, casting your mind back to your time in the Obama administration when you looked after affairs relating to NATO. I mean, looking at how the world has changed this last decade, the pre-Trump world versus the current world, I just thought it was really striking that the German foreign minister should be saying that, in fact, 2% of GDP being spent on defense might not actually be enough. And to think that 10 years ago, it almost seemed like a difficult target to get NATO member states to agree to that 2%. I mean, you have to hand it to Donald Trump that he has given NATO quite a wake-up call.
Well, I think it was Putin who rang the wake-up call bell. I think the idea of having to increase defense spending and understanding how far behind the West was in terms of our own defense and our defense industry and our ability to support Ukraine in this case. I think that wake-up call came late. It should have come after the Russians went into Georgia in 2008, but it didn't. And that was right before Obama, and there was opportunities during the Obama days to pull up our socks in the West, and we got instead diverted to China and the reset with Russia early on with Hillary Clinton when she was Secretary of State. So the wake-up call came late, but it came from Putin. Now, you're right about Trump. He's always felt that the allies didn't do enough and that they can't even do the 2%. And he was beating up allies pretty badly back during his first term. That is still his view, even though 23 allies have reached 2%. And a lot of allies, including the Germans, are saying we need to do more. But that's based not so much on Trump and a second term. That's really based on what's going to happen with Ukraine because Trump is now will be in office, and what might happen after Ukraine should it embolden Russia with a bigger military, a battle-hardened military, more modern military. What else Putin might want to do to try to resurrect imperial Russia, if you will, or communist Russia in terms of territory. That's what's making nations want to spend more money. And Germany is going to have to be the engine to all of that, to really make things go in Europe in terms of European efforts. And so I'm glad to hear Germany saying that. But it's really thanks to Putin more than Trump. He certainly adds spice to it, but the driver is Putin.
Okay, I just want to ask you one last question, which is that when obviously Donald Trump has spoken to around 70 world leaders now, we're told. One of them was, of course, the Ukrainian leader, Vladimir Zelensky. But we're told that when that call took place, Elon Musk was present as well. I'm just wondering what you see Elon Musk's role being in all of this.
Well, we're all very interested in that, but I don't think we're going to see him as a cabinet secretary. I don't think Elon Musk is suited for the kind of work in a large bureaucratic cabinet office handling the commerce or whatever it is. I think we will see him as an advisor. He might have some kind of title, but I think he's going to be unchained, if you will. And I think he will be weighing in with Trump every day on this topic or the next topic. Maybe he'll be given some specific portfolio of something or another, sent on special missions. You know, he'll be doing that kind of thing. He also has a pretty big industry to run. And that's something I'm sure that he will take his time. But I really think he will be a factor in the next 4 years for sure. We'll hear a lot out of him. We'll hear him on X and on Truth Social too. So he's going to be certainly part of the landscape. But I don't see him occupying a formal government post the way a cabinet secretary would.
All right. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Really appreciate it. Jim Townsend, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Now, the Trump effect appears to be making a mark in the world of cryptocurrencies, with Bitcoin crossing an all-time high of $80,000 US. After the Republicans secured the presidency and the Senate and edged closer to controlling the House, many are placing an early bet on the Trump administration. That's in the hopes that the president-elect follows through on his promises, including building a national stockpile of the digital currency. Well, for more on this, we can speak now to Peter McCormack, who is the chairman of Real Bedford FC and who is also the host of What Bitcoin Did and also the Mr. Obnoxious podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. I gather you also co-own that football club with the crypto investors, the Winklevoss twins. Thank you very much for speaking to us. I just want to start by asking you, and Bitcoin crossing the $82,000 US mark in Monday trading, and I just want to ask you why you think it's spiking like this.
Well, actually, it's crossed 84,000 just now, which is quite interesting. It's moving pretty fast. Look, I think the main reason is similar to the rest of the markets. I think the markets are very confident that under a Trump administration, which is hopefully going to be more pro-business and more pro-Bitcoin than the Biden administration, that it's an opportunity now to invest in the cryptocurrency Bitcoin without risk of too much bureaucracy and regulatory oversight under the Biden administration, with Gary Gensler at the head of the SEC and Elizabeth Warren's anti-crypto army. There was certainly a number of attacks that came both from the state and then subsequently from the media. So I feel like with Trump being pro-BTC and pro-business, he came to the Bitcoin conference. He's talked about wanting to support miners in America, that I think a lot of people are now pretty confident that the administration won't be getting in the way of the industry. But secondly, you know, this hasn't happened in isolation. If you look at the markets have responded well to Trump too. So I think that overall this is just a more confident outlook from people, whether they're in business or within the Bitcoin industry itself.
So, Peter, basically what you're saying is the Trump pump, as some people are dubbing it, is making people more enthusiastic about cryptocurrencies because there'll be less regulation. I mean, is there an overwhelming perception that the outgoing Biden administration's been somehow hostile to the whole cryptocurrency universe?
I mean, it's just not just a feeling. It's based in fact. They have been hostile, both with legislation and the way they've built up various factions within the US government, which has gone after what is really the freedoms and liberty and the rights that people want to be able to hold Bitcoin as an asset and use Bitcoin in their day-to-day business. The US dollar has been debased continually. We've seen massive amounts of inflation. We've seen that also here in the UK with the pound and across Europe. Bitcoin has been a kind of safe haven for a lot of people trying to escape inflation. It is the hedge against inflation, where historically kind of more wealthy people have done this with property and with gold. Bitcoin is a little bit easier for the more general public to access because you can download an application, you can buy small amounts. But it's definitely had the administration be very hostile towards it, trying to regulate access, the on-ramps, the off-ramps. They've tried to move people away from self-custody in their Bitcoin. Trump has come back and said, no, he's not going to do this. He's going to support people's right to self-custody. He's going to support the right to mine. So I think this is an administration which is approaching this entirely differently from the Biden administration.
And you mentioned the uses for Bitcoin. I gather you bought your football club, Real Bedford, using Bitcoin. Correct me if I'm wrong. I'm assuming you've invested quite a bit in Bitcoin, and you must be rather pleased looking at the numbers going up today.
Well, so no, I didn't buy the club with Bitcoin. I bought the club with traditional pounds, fiat money. But we have, as a football club, since we started, made the decision that we would hold Bitcoin as a treasury asset. And that's with whether we've taken sponsorships in Bitcoin or whether people have bought things at the club with Bitcoin. We sell tickets and burgers and merch for Bitcoin on a match day. Also, we took a $4.5 million investment from Cameron and Tyler Winklevoss from their family office, Winklevoss Capital, and we immediately converted that into Bitcoin. So our treasury position now, I can tell you, because I've got it up here for you, we're £1.25 million up. And for a small football club, that's a significant amount of money. And that strengthens what we're doing, because we've got quite our bold ambitions. We want to get this club firstly into the Football League, then the Premier League, and having Bitcoin as a treasury asset has made a huge difference in what we want to do.
Are you saying it's up by that much just in the last couple of days?
No. In the last few days, it's a good few 100,000, but we've been stacking Bitcoin since early 2022 in our treasury as a football club. And, we continue to stack, and we added to that with the investment that came from Tyler and Cameron. But the whole position, the whole treasury, because for every Bitcoin we receive, we track the purchase price, and then we track the increase in prices. And every single Bitcoin that we've purchased is obviously now in the green, and our total treasury position is up 1.25 million.
Okay, at the beginning of this conversation, you said that Bitcoin's trading at about 84,000. Well, it has been at various stages in the day. I mean, some people talking about 100,000 as being the next threshold. Do you think that's just around the corner?
Yeah, I think that's fairly reasonable. I think most people thought it happened by year end, but the way it's trading at the moment, I mean, it could happen by day end today, or it could happen tomorrow. Michael Saylor's just bought, I think, another 27,000 Bitcoin. He spent $2 billion on that. There are strong rumors of nation states now stacking Bitcoin. Obviously, as you mentioned, the US government said they would hold Bitcoin as a reserve asset. And so you get into these periods with Bitcoin where the price starts to move, and people who've considered it before maybe get a little bit of FOMO and start diving in. But I think the main point is not what the price might be now or what it is in the future, is that we live in a world where governments are fiscally irresponsible. They're spending more than they bring in. Their deficits are increasing, and this leads to inflation, and that affects anyone who doesn't hold assets. And so Bitcoin is that safe haven to escape. So I don't think the short-term price matters. I don't think the long-term price matters. I think what matters is over time. If you're a hard worker and you're earning money, you want to save for the future, you can't save in pounds and dollars because the currency is being debased. You can only save in hard assets, which is gold, which is Bitcoin, which is property. And Bitcoin is just a really easy way for anyone to be able to start saving. So I think the more important point is not the short-term price movements, but overall, can you protect your wealth? And with Bitcoin, you can do that.
Okay, but just looking at the medium term, I mean, Donald Trump hasn't even taken office yet. We're about 70 days away from the 20th of January. So, I mean, would you perhaps say that Bitcoin's got a long way to go from trading around the 80,000 mark today to where it could be by the 20th of January?
Sure. I mean, look, it could be at 100, it could be 120,000. This will be my fourth bull market that I've experienced with Bitcoin. And when it starts to tear, you really aren't always prepared for what might happen. I mean, it genuinely kind of melts people's brains, the way the price can increase so rapidly. I mean, you'll see so many different predictions for next year. Some people saying, oh, it could hit 150,000. You'll have other people saying it could hit $500,000. I mean, my prediction's always been within a decade, it will be over $1 million of Bitcoin. Could happen next year. It is a fixed limit currency. There will only be 21 million. The circulating supply is probably less than 2 million. If a lot of people are trying to buy that will naturally see the price increase. So I would say be prepared to have your face melted by what might happen with this.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, I mean, there could very well be some sort of a correction in the market. But it's interesting listening to what you're saying, because you sound like you're reading from the same song sheet as Elon Musk, who points to the fact that there's a looming, what he calls financial emergency. He says that countries are being driven into bankruptcy by what you've described as well as unsustainable debt levels. I mean, it sounds like you're more or less aligned in terms of your opinion on what Bitcoin might ultimately, the importance Bitcoin might ultimately have in the future.
Yeah, I mean, it's just basic mathematics. If you understand economics, this is basic mathematics. Countries are running very high deficits. If you look at the UK now, we're almost certainly facing a sovereign debt crisis. Will that be in the next 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? Who knows? Sometimes these things can stretch out longer than you planned. But with the government continuing to increase their borrowing, the amount they're borrowing, with interest rates going up, the debt just increases more and more. I think we're at about 2.2 trillion in the UK of debt. The US is about to cross the $36 trillion threshold. You know, there is every single Western liberal democracy has a debt issue, and nobody is facing it. No one is implementing the austerity required or the efficiencies required to slow down that debt, let alone dip into it. So if you're going to increase the debt, one thing's going to happen. We've seen it throughout history. It's pure mathematics. If you continue to increase the debt, if you continue to service it by increasing the money supply, you will get inflation. And who does that hurt the most? That hurts the poorest in society. That hurts the middle class. And so, yeah, I mean, all I can say is go and read economics in one lesson, learn basic math, and you will see the charts. You will look and see the writings on the wall. We will have a sovereign debt crisis.
And of course, a little word of caution about cryptocurrencies, because there are, I gather, 25,000 of them. They're not all as successful as Bitcoin, are they? For every one that succeeds, how many do you reckon fail?
Well, only one has really truly succeeded and the rest have all failed. And the reason they failed is the promise of cryptocurrencies or Bitcoin is decentralization. And Bitcoin is the only meaningfully decentralized cryptocurrency. All the rest are centralized, or their trajectory is to be more centralized. So they can't sit outside of government reach. They can be influenced. So I would say for the one that's created, there are thousands of thousands that have failed. I mean, I just don't pay any attention to them. I just consider them as affinity scams. They're trying to get your money. They're trying to get your Bitcoin. The only cryptocurrency anyone should pay attention to is Bitcoin.
It's interesting using the word scam, because that's how Donald Trump described Bitcoin about 3 years ago. He said this: Bitcoin just seems like a scam. I don't like it because it's another currency competing against the dollar. And that was 3 years ago. What do you reckon's changed in his mind to make him now, we could argue, as being sort of a champion of cryptocurrency, which he is now?
Well, I think a lot of people, when they first discover Bitcoin, think it might be a scam. But changing your mind is a good thing, because a man who can't change his mind can't really change anything. And if you're going to be the president of the leading country in the world, the world's police, you need to be flexible to change your mind to things. My expectation is he's spent the time with the people who truly understand Bitcoin, and they've explained it to him. And so I think now at a time where they do have a debt crisis, when people have sat down and said, look, Bitcoin not only is a potential solution to the debt crisis, but it's also creating jobs. I mean, I've been out to various states in the US where there are mining companies, and he's maybe had the time to learn about the jobs they're creating, how the miners are integrated with the grids for load balancing. I mean, once you really go down the Bitcoin rabbit hole, it's very hard to come back and say, okay, this is a scam or there's something wrong with it. I think the real scam is the US dollar.
Okay, well, I'm being told we're out of time. Really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Peter McCormack, thank you very much indeed for your time today.
Thank you.
That is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, goodbye.
Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Arabiya News,
It's very impressive.
where knowledge meets perspective.
Osaka. There's just so much to learn, see, and do. Osaka has a population of about 2.5 million. Often, Osaka is considered the anti-capital of Japan, where Tokyo is its capital. It is the central metropolis of the Kansai region and the largest of the Osaka, Kobe, Kyoto trio. However way you regard the city, there are many opportunities for you to discover it. Enter the city and you'll immediately get a feel of its commercial-centric vibe. To be able to tour around it better, know how the city is divided into 24 wards. There's Kita, the newer center of the city. Umeda is where the main terminal is located. You'll find the huge department stores and boutiques there, as well as theaters for entertainment. Just look for the shops clustered around the JR Osaka Station and Umeda Station. Namba is the main railway station, also surrounded with department stores and endless places for shopping. Meanwhile, Minami is the traditional commercial and cultural center of Osaka. It is further broken down into two wards, Chuo and Naniwa. Shinsaibashi and Hori are the fashion wards, while Dotonbori is the best place for eating and dining. Semba is where you will find the business districts of Yodoyabashi, Duojima, and Homachi, as well as the financial district of Kitahama. Tennoji is the area around the main subway stations and rail lines. The ward was named after the historical Shitennoji Temple. You'll also find the zoo and the park here, as well as the Tsutenkaku Tower. Then there's the Shinsekai, known as the amusement area in the old days. Of course, there's the Osaka Castle, one of the most visited tourist attractions in Japan. Kyobashi nearby is where you will find the Osaka Business Park. The north includes the Shin, Osaka, and Juso wards, while the east houses Osaka's suburbs. The southern suburbs of Osaka, containing various districts, which has the Sumiyoshi Taisha Grand Shrine. And finally, the Bay Area is where you'll see the gigantic facilities.
From the White House to Gaza, Kiev to Beijing, elections, economics, and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deepfake, and artificial intelligence,
They've got to have a vote and a say.
it's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
My campaign is going very well.
presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers.
As Arabs, as Middle Eastern, we're too emotional.
Join me on the Riz Khan Show for empowering conversation.
Bali, home to some of the warmest, most welcoming people in the world, Bali. Travel the city and you're sure to be greeted with friendly smiles and accommodating locals. The people of Bali are known for being patriotic, and they would go out of their way to make tourists feel comfortable and make sure that they get to see the best of the city. For one, Bali is known for its rich culture and heritage. For the Balinese, religion is integral. There are in fact over 20,000 temples on the island dedicated especially for spirituality and community. The city is also alive with festivals and ceremonies characterized by traditional Balinese dance, music, drama, and local cuisine that every tourist would definitely want to be a part of. Bali is also known for its breathtaking natural resources. You should see its picturesque rice terraces, soaring volcanoes, pristine crater lakes, sacred caves, and lush tropical forests. Many visit Bali for its tropical beaches, while its dramatic coastline never fails to impress. Waterfalls are also popular in Bali, as the city has a lot to explore. Visitors also like to try whitewater rafting in Bali, try the high ropes courses, or visit the Kintamani volcano. Kuta is a mecca for surfers and backpackers looking for lively nightlife and great waves. The botanical garden is also said to be one of the best in the world. Bali is also great for shopping. Popular marketplaces are found in Kuta, Ubud, and Sukawati. You're sure to find endless rows of stores selling a variety of knickknacks. For more unique finds, you should visit Seminyak. Seminyak is Bali's answer to the hipster movement, where eclectic bars, cool cafes, and chic international boutiques fill the streets. Food in Bali is just as amazing. Almost every warung or local eat shops offer the best local dishes, from satay ayam to soto ayam to nasi goreng. It's where you get to eat delicious meals for very affordable prices. But there are also fine dining restaurants in Bali that will serve all kinds of food. The city, after all, takes on many influences from all over the world.
At Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Arabiya News,
It's very impressive.
where knowledge meets perspective.